Hey guys, in a place of supreme power and tens of kilos of dresses, the Queen can go a month without touching a drop of water, not because she is busy, but because she is afraid of bathing. Beneath the aroma of flowers lies perspiration absorbed deep within the fabric. Under those fragrant gloves sits a coating of dust that hasn't been cleansed in 7 days. The castle gleams brilliantly, yet beneath those plush drapes, upon those down-filled cushions exists an odour that chronicles have never documented. Tonight you'll enter the authentic behind-the-scenes world of royalty where mysteries remain unwashed. So before settling in, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely appreciate the content I create here. Now, lower those lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background ambience, and let's settle into this evening's exploration together. If you've ever envisioned a noble lady emerging from a silk-lined carriage, gliding past stone pillars into a torchlit royal chamber, you likely imagined elegance, fresh complexion, dusted cheeks, perhaps a gentle hint of lavender trailing behind her into the space. What seldom appears in those daydreams is her actual scent underneath all that finery, or more accurately, what she avoided doing to alter it. For countless royal ladies throughout the ages, cleanliness wasn't a concern, it was practically an afterthought. Not because they were indifferent to how they looked, they cared far too much about appearances. Yet when it involved getting clean, using soap and water, matters became complex. The primary and perhaps most shocking reality is that noble women rarely bathed, not even once per month. Sometimes hardly once annually. This wasn't due to laziness, it was conviction. Physicians during medieval times and continuing through the Renaissance cautioned that bathing might weaken one's constitution. They believed water dilated pores, allowing illness to enter. Rather than washing, women concealed themselves. They applied fragrances, dusting powders, and oils to create a sort of aromatic shield between their bodies and the world around them. A royal lady didn't step into a basin of soap and suds. She entered a mist of flower water and animal musk. Somehow, this was deemed more sophisticated. Fragrance wasn't simply an ornament, it served as protection. At the French palace of Louis XIV, for instance, aristocrats were famous for reapplying scent multiple times daily. Their garments were drenched in botanical waters, their gloves were stuffed with aromatic plants. Their hair was dusted with ground petals and occasionally even crushed bones. The objective was never to cleanse, only to mask. One royal lover boasted of having bathed just twice in her entire life. Once at birth and once on her wedding evening. Nobody thought this peculiar. It was almost praiseworthy. Why risk exposure to water when you could simply layer on more fragrance? Naturally, this produced a building effect. Every day brought another application of oil, another touch of musk, another spray of something flowery. The outcome wasn't always agreeable. Beyond those satin hangings and embroidered cushions, there was frequently a noticeable thickness in the atmosphere. It carried scents of citrus blossoms, certainly, but also of fabric, of sweat, of something undefined yet unpleasant to inhale deeply. Nevertheless, visitors smiled politely, they acknowledged approvingly, they praised the aroma, because to suggest otherwise would offend the court. The royal bathing chambers themselves, when they existed, served more ceremonial than functional purposes. Constructed from marble or stone, featuring gilded faucets and sculpted lion heads, they appeared magnificent. Yet they saw little use. A queen might enter one for a formal occasion. She might soak briefly in scented oils, then emerge without ever handling a piece of soap. The water, reused across multiple baths, frequently remained murky and stagnant. Towels, if employed, were ornamental, decorated, perfumed, sometimes rigid with starch. They provided no absorption. Many women simply stood near a fireplace afterward and waited to air dry. Drying required patience, particularly when wearing multiple layers. A typical ensemble might include 5 or 6 pieces. Undergarments, corsets, overskirts and wraps, each one weighty, each one retaining moisture like a sponge. The aim was to avoid getting damp initially. The fewer occasions the body encountered water, the simpler the routine. That was the reasoning. The body wasn't scrubbed. It was dabbed, it was decorated, it was wrapped in lace and silk and expected to comply. Beneath all this, the skin had to cope independently. Royal women created methods to address rashes, itching, and other results of infrequent washing. Powders were applied to comfort, but also to disguise. A rash might be sprinkled with starch or hidden with a beauty spot. If the skin developed blemishes, it was covered with white lead paint. If it formed sores, some rouge helped blur the boundaries. Nothing was healed, only concealed. Appearance trumped comfort. Even the attendants who assisted in dressing these women learned to work without acknowledging the smell. They discovered how to secure laces without tugging too forcefully on irritated skin. They understood when to provide fresh linen and when to refrain. There existed unwritten protocols about what could be voiced aloud. A queen might collapse from heat and perfume, yet nobody criticised the corset or the musk. They simply cracked a window and continued. Occasionally these hygiene practices resulted in infections. Skin deteriorated under the burden of unwashed fabric. Hair thinned from repeated applications of pomade and powder. None of this appeared in official paintings. There, the royal woman seemed flawless. Unblemished cheeks, lustrous curls, serene eyes. No artist depicted the wounds or the bruises. Under the gown, the paradox was evident, yet accepted. To be royal meant looking beautiful, not being clean. Even cleanliness became suspect. Washing excessively was viewed as prideful, or worse, abnormal. A woman who washed daily might be likened to a prostitute. A queen who washed monthly was considered prudent. The rest simply powdered, perfumed, and crossed their fingers. What's remarkable is how routine this appeared then. Nobody challenged it. Royal women were instructed from childhood to shun water, to apply oils, to sit in scented smoke instead of steam. They weren't reckless. They were following the finest guidance available. Even as they scratched beneath their jewels or blinked through the sting of their perfume, they believed they were acting correctly. It's simple now to look back and chuckle, to picture the halls of Versailles as floral-scented greenhouses of discomfort. Yet, in reality, they were refined, they were admired, they were imitated by courts throughout Europe. The odour was simply included in the package. Over time, it became unnoticeable, the way constant sound disappears if you listen long enough. So if you've ever imagined yourself in royal attire walking through a candlelit palace, take a moment to consider what that would actually feel like. The heaviness of the dress, the warmth of the chamber, the dense scent that clings to your sleeves and refuses to release. Maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to value your soap a bit more. As we'll discover going forward, this was merely the start. Under the gowns and gloves there remained more to conceal, and even less to wash. So, beneath all the satin and perfume, there was always more to hide and more to ignore. One of the most fascinating aspects of royal hygiene wasn't what they practiced, but what they absolutely refused to do. Among these refusals, one emerges quite distinctly. Washing their garments, not just the magnificent outer clothing, which was delicate and costly, but also the inner layers, the clothes worn against the skin, the ones that absorbed every drop of moisture, every trace of body warmth, every lingering aroma of cooked meat or rose water. These garments, rather than being scrubbed and boiled as a laundress might do, were handled with a different method, a method that required patience, a bright day, and sometimes a wish. In most royal homes, linen underclothes were deemed self-cleaning. Not literally, naturally, but nearly so. It was thought that if you suspended them in fresh air and allowed them to breathe properly, the sun and breeze would eliminate any unpleasantness. Washing them repeatedly was seen as both pointless and risky. Hot water might damage the threads. Harsh soap could destroy the material. Scrubbing was unthinkable. Instead, they were lightly brushed, perhaps touched with a cloth, soaked in spirits or perfume, then spread across a chair beside the window. That sufficed, allegedly. There are accounts of queens wearing identical shifts for multiple days, sometimes weeks, before permitting them to be refreshed. Refreshed rarely meant washed. It meant shaken out, misted, with something floral, and occasionally rubbed with herbs. Lavender was preferred. Rosemary as well, a touch of lemon balm if someone felt particularly cautious. Yet soap and water only when absolutely necessary. Necessary typically meant obvious stains or odour so powerful that even the servants started to notice. These undergarments weren't simple items. They were meticulously sewn, often embroidered, sometimes perfumed during creation. A queen chemise might be decorated with lace or bordered with tiny pearls. It wasn't merely clothing, it was part of her identity. Yet it remained linen, still fabric, still something that contacted her skin repeatedly. The fact that it wasn't regularly washed didn't mean it stayed fresh. It simply meant people chose not to see. In a court where appearances mattered more than comfort, there developed a kind of courteous blindness. Everyone agreed to overlook the reality under the silken brocade, the layers of unwashed linen, the rigid corsets that contained more than just a waistline, the hidden stains, the moisture in the creases. It wasn't graceful, but it was accepted. Nobody mentioned it openly, except perhaps in letters sent home, far from court gossip's ears. Some chambermaids remained silent simply because they had no alternative. Their duty was to fold the chemises, tighten the corsets, and remove the perfumed cloths for airing. They weren't permitted to object. A disgusted expression or casual remark could result in dismissal. For many of these women, a position in the Queen's household represented the pinnacle they could achieve. They powdered, they brushed, they aired, and they kept quiet. In exceptional cases, when garments truly couldn't be salvaged, they weren't cleaned, they were discarded, especially undergarments. A ripped chemise might be torn into rags and sent to the kitchen, a severely stained petticoat quietly tossed into the fire. New ones were commissioned. The concept wasn't to preserve, but to maintain the facade. That facade was of a woman who was perpetually fresh, always composed and always perfectly scented. Yet the truth lived in the stitching. The longer something was worn, the more it absorbed not just perspiration, but anxiety. Not just perfume, but terror. The court wasn't a peaceful environment. Women sat through lengthy ceremonies, stood through feasts, danced under blazing chandeliers, all while tightly bound in fabric that wouldn't breathe. When they returned to their chambers at night, they didn't undress and toss their clothing into a hamper. They removed it carefully, spread it out to air, and often wore it again before morning. Even Queen Elizabeth, renowned for her precise appearance, had her undergarments cleaned infrequently. Some correspondence suggests her laundresses used breadcrumbs to scrub away spots. Not soap, not washing, just gentle rubbing. A type of royal dry cleaning using kitchen ingredients. One wonders if the garden birds noticed anything peculiar about their morning treats. Other techniques existed too. Some women kept bundles of dried herbs in their drawers and trunks. Others pressed clean clothes between layers of fabric to soak up excess oils. A few even placed citrus peels in their wardrobes, not because they believed it would cleanse the material, but because the fragrance masked what wasn't clean. This was seen as tactical, a way to shift attention from what couldn't be corrected. Still, nobody questioned the approach. They simply practiced it, generation after generation. Wisdom passed from mother to daughter, noblewoman to lady-in-waiting. Wash sparingly, air frequently, scent everything. If it starts smelling too much like reality, add more lavender, more rose petals, more ground cloves. Today, we might find this hard to accept. We discuss hygiene as if it's fundamental, as if it's natural. Yet for centuries, it wasn't. It was extravagance. It was hazardous. It was something best managed from afar. For royal women, cleanliness wasn't about soap. It was about deception. If nobody acknowledged the smell, then perhaps it wasn't there. Night after night, beneath carved ceilings and silk bed curtains, queens and princesses retired in garments that had never been truly clean. They settled into beds lined with sheets that had been aired but never washed. They closed their eyes under covers that smelled of spices and camphor and memory. They slept as soundly as possible, knowing that tomorrow they would rise, powder themselves again and continue the act. Pretending, more than perfume, was the real foundation of royal hygiene. Moving forward, we'll step even deeper into that world of cover-ups and contradictions, to a place where perfume wasn't worn, but transported not just for beauty, but for survival. If perfume was the initial layer of illusion, then accessories were the second. In the royal courts of Europe, particularly during the 1500s and 1600s, scent wasn't just about vanity. It was an instrument, a defence, sometimes even a weapon. For women who possessed very little actual authority, fragrance became a subtle communication. It informed people of your status. It announced your arrival before you appeared in a room. When necessary, it shielded you from the less pleasant realities of palace existence. One of the most popular tools in this quiet aromatic warfare was the pomander, a small metal sphere, often decorative, worn on a chain or hidden within a gown. Inside it contained a densely packed blend of herbs, resins and dried blooms. Cloves, cinnamon, ambergris, rosemary, these were the favourites, selected for their potent, lasting fragrances. When the air became heavy with candle smoke and perspiration, a lady could simply raise her pomander to her nose and inhale something better. The trend caught on quickly at court. It was almost mandatory. A woman without a pomander was either inexperienced or forgetful. Some displayed theirs on long chains dangling from the waist. Others kept them concealed in sleeves near the wrist. A few carried small perfumed handkerchiefs instead, treated with the same herbs and tucked into gloved palms. All served the same function, to provide a moment's relief from a world that didn't believe in fresh air. This wasn't just about comfort. People truly believed that foul odours could spread disease. The concept of miasma was deeply embedded. If you passed a sick room and breathed something awful, it wasn't merely unpleasant, it was perilous. So surrounding yourself with pleasant scents was more than manners. It was defence, a kind of invisible armour. Elizabeth I filled her chambers with potpourri and scented gloves. Her bedding was layered with sachets of dried lavender and herbs. Even her servants were told to keep fragrant cloths handy. The objective was to maintain a space that smelled not just agreeable, but authoritative. The scent of power, it appeared, was a mixture of roses, cloves, and a touch of desperation. Perfumed gloves were especially fashionable. Initially, they were a practical answer. Treated leather didn't smell pleasant, so glove makers started soaking their products in floral oils and spice mixtures. Eventually, these gloves became a status symbol, a present from one noble to another, a sign of favour or affection. Yet they also served a more subtle purpose. Worn over hands that seldom touched soap and water, they helped mask whatever the sleeves couldn't. Sometimes the gloves were so saturated with perfume that they discoloured the skin. One diplomat reportedly complained that after greeting a French duchess, he reeked of ambergris for the entire day. He didn't mention whether he objected, only that the scent persisted longer than their chat. Naturally, not all odours could be managed so tidily. The royal palaces were bustling places, hundreds of people, animals, fires, meals and open windows all competing for the same atmosphere. Scented accessories helped, but they didn't eliminate the source. They just floated above it like a polite fiction, a distraction that made it easier to smile through discomfort. To worsen matters, many of these perfumes contained ingredients that would appall modern sensibilities. Musk, for instance, was extracted from animal glands. Ambergris originates from whale digestive systems. Civet was gathered from the scent glands of a small African creature. These were costly, rare, and considered luxurious. Yet they were also sharp and sometimes overpowering. Too much musk could empty a corridor faster than burnt dinner. Still, women wore these fragrances proudly. They dabbed them on handkerchiefs, sprinkled them on pillows, pressed them into hair accessories. Some even burned scented wax on small dishes to perfume the room before visitors arrived. The goal was always to create an environment that felt pure, even if it wasn't, to convince both guest and resident that beauty still ruled, even as the rugs held decades of dust. There's something quietly admirable about their dedication to this system. They knew the clothes weren't fresh. They knew the baths were infrequent. They knew the air was thick. Yet they didn't surrender. They just worked harder to mask it. Another ribbon, another sprig of herbs, another dip of the gloves into violet oil. It's tempting to mock all of this now, to picture women moving through palaces like walking spice cabinets. Yet there's also something understandable here, the need to control what little you can, to create a space of comfort in an environment you didn't design. For royal women, perfume wasn't a luxury, it was necessity. Perhaps in a court full of watching eyes and whispered criticism, smelling appropriate mattered more than being appropriate. A woman who carried the proper scent might be remembered. One who didn't might be forgotten. The reality is, royal courts were full of paradoxes. They demanded perfection, but offered women few resources to achieve it. They praised beauty, but discouraged real care. They expected grace, but provided no solitude. So women did what they could. They powdered, they perfumed, they sewed herbs into their dress linings, they held pomanders to their faces and hoped the world wouldn't notice how desperately they were trying. Even if nobody said it openly, everyone understood that pleasant fragrance was social currency, a way of declaring, I belong here. I understand the customs. I might not control the water or the walls or the laws that govern my existence, but I can choose my scent. Sometimes that was sufficient. The irony, naturally, is that some of these fragrances created their own problems. They irritated the skin. They triggered coughing spells. Occasionally, they even caused fainting. Yet by the time anyone realized, the fashion had already established itself, and nobody wanted to be first to abandon it. So the gloves remained on, the herbs stayed tucked. Pomanders clinked softly at the waist, swaying with each measured step through marble corridors that smelled underneath everything like too many people and insufficient soap. Moving forward, we'll discover what happened when the odours were no longer a private concern, but something everyone in the chamber had to endure, including the Queen herself. By now, the court had grown accustomed to pretending that everything smelled pleasant, that perfume fixed everything, that a cloud of rose oil was sufficient to mask a month's worth of perspiration under brocade. Yet sometimes pretending wasn't adequate. Sometimes the issue didn't remain concealed behind silk. Sometimes it made itself apparent in ways no pomander could address. That's when things became complicated. When the Queen herself needed relief, the entire court had to pretend they didn't observe. Before modern plumbing, every royal residence had its method of handling nature's demands. The chamber pot was the Queen's faithful companion, discreet, portable, ceramic or pewter, and almost always disguised to resemble something else. It might be hidden behind a privacy screen or positioned beside a velvet-covered chair. It might even have a lid that closed like a treasure box. Yet it was still a pot, and it still had a purpose. During a lengthy reception, a banquet, or a council session, the Queen couldn't excuse herself casually. There were no quiet passages or nearby lavatories. If she required relief, she used what was accessible. What was accessible was often nearby. A lady in waiting would recognise the signals. She would gather the fabric, position the screen, and everyone else would stare deliberately at the ceiling while attempting to breathe through a scented handkerchief. This wasn't shocking. It was standard. The court understood how to orchestrate around it. Musicians played more loudly, pages moved in and out, servants passed with platters blocking the view. The moment passed, the curtain was pulled back, and the Queen resumed as though nothing had occurred. Everyone nodded and continued, because pretending was courteous. Pretending was survival. Afterward, the pot was removed by servants trained in discretion. They didn't gossip. They didn't react. They didn't wrinkle their noses. They simply lifted the porcelain, held it steady, and walked cautiously through the hallway until they reached a place nobody wanted to consider. Some palaces had specific disposal rooms. Others had openings in the floor leading to collection areas. Either way, it wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. The smell didn't simply vanish. No matter how much perfume was applied afterward, it remained, especially in heavy materials, especially in tapestries that hadn't been cleaned since the previous reign. Even the thick stone walls absorbed it. So courtiers started carrying scented fans, not just for warmth, but to wave something pleasant toward their faces, to create a tiny current of denial in a room where denial was standard practice. Elizabeth I had her approach. She allegedly kept perfumed gloves at her writing table and dried herbs beside her bed. When she travelled, she brought her bedding treated with lavender and camphor. Yet even she wasn't exempt from the realities of palace life. There were occasions when she too had to pause a meeting, vanish behind a velvet screen, and trust that her ladies would maintain the performance. They did. Every time. A lapse in protocol wasn't just embarrassing, it was risky. A moment of vulnerability could be interpreted as illness, and illness meant weakness. In a court full of ambitious observers, even the act of relieving oneself had to be wrapped in dignity. It had to appear as if nothing had happened. It had to leave no evidence. That's where accessories returned to importance. Scented handkerchiefs were crucial. Pomanders hung at the waist. Sprigs of herbs were sewn into sleeves. Some women even wore small pouches filled with mint and crushed petals inside their corsets, against the skin. These weren't fashion statements. They were survival equipment, weapons in the quiet battle against odour. Yet smell wasn't the only concern. There was also sound. In a silent chamber, an unexpected noise could draw attention. So servants learned to hum quietly, to drop something at precisely the right moment, to cough, shift a chair or open a window. Every movement was rehearsed, every distraction carefully planned. The aim was not just to hide what was happening, but to maintain the illusion that nothing ever needed to happen. This wasn't exclusive to England. Throughout Europe, royal women developed their codes. In France, the phrase "retired to her chambers" became a delicate way to explain an absence. In Spain, "she takes the air" frequently meant the Queen had gone to a private corner with her trusted servant and a bucket disguised as furniture. The Austrians, ever methodical, used chimes to signal transitions, giving everyone sufficient time to turn respectfully away. The truth, naturally, was that even queens are human. No amount of civet oil or jasmine-scented gloves could change that. They perspired, they digested, they expelled. Then they powdered their cheeks, straightened their posture, and returned to the room as if nothing had ever occurred. It's not shocking, then, that court etiquette manuals started including entire chapters on managing these moments. There were diagrams for positioning screens, instructions for folding fabric, recommendations for which fragrances worked best in summer. It became its own system, a performance within the performance. Some courtiers took pride in mastering this choreography. They could detect the moment a queen shifted in her seat. They knew how to pass fresh linen without drawing notice. They could refill the pot with rose water and return it silently. For them, invisibility was a skill, and the ability to pretend nothing smelled was a virtue. Despite all their efforts, the truth didn't disappear. It lingered in the air, just faintly. just enough to remind everyone that the palace, for all its gold and grandeur, was still a building full of people. People wearing too many layers, people eating too much rich food, people sharing confined spaces with significant consequences. Still, nobody objected, at least not publicly. To admit the Queen's chamber smelled like anything other than violets was to risk your position. So ambassadors wrote their observations in private, servants whispered in corners, and the rest of the court learned to adapt, or rather, to not mention it. After all, what was the option? Ask the Queen to wash more? Suggest plumbing? Recommend soap? Nobody was brave enough to attempt it. Instead, they adjusted. They learned to breathe lightly. They learned to smile without inhaling. They learned to praise the lovely scent of roses, even when the room smelled more like humanity. Next, we'll move from what was happening behind the curtain to what was happening on the surface. Once the perfumes faded, the powders took over. If you think hiding smell was challenging, try hiding your skin. Powder was omnipresent. It clung to faces, settled on necklines. Particles floated in the air like fine dust. In the royal courts of Europe, powder wasn't just part of a beauty regimen. It was the regimen. Applied with skilled hands and serious purpose, it transformed pale skin into china, dark circles into smooth surfaces, and blemishes into something politely overlooked, at least from a distance. Up close, the illusion didn't always work, yet that didn't matter, because at court, distance was part of the show, and powder helped keep that show running. For royal women, fair skin wasn't just trendy, it was essential. A light complexion implied wealth, sophistication, and the privilege of remaining indoors. It identified you as someone who didn't need to labour under the sun, someone who didn't sweat like a cook or smell like a stable hand. Yet achieving that appearance required more than favourable lighting. It required layers. The ingredients in those layers were seldom gentle. The most popular foundation was created from white lead, mixed with vinegar, water, and sometimes egg whites. It formed a creamy paste that adhered to the skin. The outcome was smooth, bright, and lethal. White lead is poisonous, slowly, silently poisonous. It penetrates the skin, damages tissue, and weakens the body's defences. Yet at the time, nobody questioned it because it was effective. It covered scars, smoothed over smallpox marks, and created the appearance of health, which, ironically, it was destroying. Rouge came next, a touch on each cheek, sometimes made from crushed insects, sometimes from mercury-based mixtures, just enough to seem alive, just enough to balance the pale base without looking like you'd been exercising. Lip colour came last, a hint of red, made from cinnabar or plant extracts, applied with a small brush or fingertip. The entire process required time and a steady hand, and occasionally a second person to help with the angles. These cosmetics didn't wash off easily. Most weren't designed to. Women slept in them, added more the following morning, touched up between courses. Removing it all meant using oils, vinegar, or cloth soaked in alcohol, not water, never water. That was still considered dangerous. Rather than removing old layers, they added new ones, powder upon powder, week after week. Eventually, the skin deteriorated. It blistered, cracked, and turned grey at the edges. In some portraits, you can notice the damage if you look carefully. A certain stiffness in the jaw, a slight puffiness under the eye. Yet painters were merciful. They smoothed it away with their brushes. The myth of perfect skin continued. To hide the worst of it, women used beauty patches, small shapes made from velvet, silk, or wax, positioned strategically on the face. A star near the temple, a crescent beside the mouth, a dot under the eye. They served dual purposes. Decoration, yes, but also concealment. A blister beneath a heart-shaped patch looked like fashion, not infection. The use of these patches became so widespread that they developed significance. A patch on the right cheek meant flirtation. On the left, loyalty near the lips. hidden desire. It became a game, a silent language spoken through felt and adhesive. Yet beneath the messages was a quieter reality. These patches were often covering things nobody wanted to discuss. Skin that had been powdered too frequently, treated with too much mercury, scrubbed with too little care. Still, the powder kept flowing. Each morning, maids opened containers of pressed lead, stirred bowls of rouge, cut fresh patches from black silk. They fanned away the residue that floated in the air, settled on furniture and clung to drapes. Some women developed coughs that never disappeared. Some lost hair, others lost teeth. Yet they rarely blamed the powder. They blamed the climate, the season, their constitution, anything except what they applied daily. It wasn't just vanity. It was a requirement. A woman who appeared at court without her face properly prepared might be described as exhausted or worse, disrespectful. Not making the effort was seen as a kind of slight to the Queen, to the event, to the entire framework of noble society. So women continued powdering even as their skin craved air, even as their reflection stopped resembling themselves. Elizabeth I was famous for her commitment to the powdered appearance. She had contracted smallpox early in life, and though she recovered, the scars never left her face. Rather than withdrawing, she embraced artifice. She wore thick white paste, heavy rouge, and elaborate wigs to distract. From afar, she appeared majestic. Up close, the damage showed, but nobody dared acknowledge it. Some courtiers took notice, in their personal letters. One ambassador described her skin as cracked porcelain. Another mentioned her eyes always appeared irritated, as if bothered. Yet they wrote these observations carefully, respectfully, because to criticise a queen's appearance was to question her authority. Powder, in its odd way, was part of that authority. There's a quiet irony in all of this. In attempting to look powerful, they weakened themselves. In trying to appear untouched, they covered the very harm the court caused. Yet the alternative wasn't attractive. To show natural skin was unimaginable. It suggested poverty, illness, madness. So they painted on wellness. They powdered on and hoped the mirror would cooperate. Some women tried to improve. They experimented with milder combinations, rice powder, ground pearls. Yet these were costly, difficult to obtain, and didn't conceal as effectively. So they frequently returned to what they knew: lead, mercury, whatever was necessary. When beauty is demanded, health becomes secondary. Today, we think of makeup as a choice, a form of self-expression. Yet for these women, it was a mask they couldn't shed, not without repercussions. It was survival in powdered form, a barrier between them and judgment. Next, we'll examine what happened when even the powder wasn't sufficient, when the damage underneath had to be addressed, not just concealed. A chapter that brings us into the world of teeth and all the inventive ways royal women tried to keep smiling, even when their mouths revealed a different story. That practiced smile was required at formal dinners, grand celebrations, during official meetings with dignitaries. A serene, agreeable look, with lips gently curved, showing just enough warmth without seeming forced. Yet underneath that graceful expression, trouble was brewing, because beyond the cosmetics, under the face paint, behind the jewellery and fine fabrics, aristocratic teeth were slowly crumbling away. Dental problems were unavoidable in noble households. Sugar, once scarce, became trendy during the Renaissance and surged in demand by the 1600s. It cost plenty, certainly, but the wealthy could afford all they wanted. Preserved fruits, sweetened beverages, syrup, sugar-coated pastries. These weren't rare delicacies. They were everyday luxuries, and the teeth suffered terribly. Modern dentistry simply didn't exist. Toothbrushes were primitive, when available at all. Some people used sticks with split ends. Others scrubbed their teeth with fabric pieces. A lucky few had bristle brushes, typically made from wild boar hair, but these weren't common. More typical was using powders, These might be ground from crushed eggshells, charred bread, limestone, sea coral or volcanic rock rubbed on with cloth or fingers. They were coarse, scratchy and often agonizing, but they created an appearance of cleanliness. The tragedy is that most of these powders caused more damage than benefit. They wore down enamel, they aggravated sensitive gums, they made tiny wounds where debris and germs could accumulate. Eventually, teeth grew dark, they loosened, they cracked. But people continued using the powders because even with the harm, pale teeth suggested youth. And at court, youth held power. When teeth came out, and they frequently did, substitutes were improvised. Elephant tusk, animal bone, and even timber were shaped to fit. Some pieces were bound in position, others were fastened to remaining teeth with wire clips. None felt comfortable. Most were only used for brief public moments, posing for paintings, appearing at banquets, welcoming foreign ambassadors. Later, they were taken out, washed with alcohol or acid, and kept until the next event. There were also stories of teeth being pulled from the mouths of peasants or corpses. These replacement teeth were purchased by the rich, scrubbed as thoroughly as possible, and placed where gaps existed. It wasn't sanitary, it wasn't secure, but it worked well enough for several months, perhaps a year, until disease developed or the gums pushed out the foreign material. Then it was back to liquid meals, porridge, and closed-mouth grins. Elizabeth I was famous for having dental decay in her later years. Some records describe her cheeks as hollow, her pronunciation somewhat unclear, but she kept up the facade. She modified her cosmetics. She smiled cautiously. She maintained distance when necessary, because displaying frailty, particularly the type that affected speech, was unacceptable. It implied aging, weakness, death, concepts no monarch wanted to acknowledge. To mask the odour, people relied on breath treatments. These weren't candies like we know them. They were mixtures of plants, seasonings, and spirits. Some chewed on spice buds or licorice seeds. Others gargled with vinegar or wine. A few kept sprigs of herbs, peppermint, hidden inside their mouths during ceremonies. The purpose wasn't freshness, it was concealment. If it didn't smell foul, it must be healthy. At least that was the theory. One especially dramatic approach was dental gems. When spaces developed, some ladies attached tiny stones, pearls, rubies, even diamonds to their surviving teeth. The concept was to shift focus away from what was gone, to make the mouth glitter. Even when the gums throbbed, it wasn't sensible. The gems regularly dropped off, were accidentally eaten, or needed constant reattachment. But for an instant they created wonder. And at court, spectacle was nearly as important as attractiveness. To prevent losing additional teeth, some ladies tried eating less: broths, tender bread, cooked vegetables. But royal dining didn't cooperate. Meats were heavy, sweets were sticky, courses were covered in gravies. The chewing never ended, and with it, the gradual destruction of oral health. No matter how carefully they dabbed with acid or wiped with fabric, the deterioration went on. There were also efforts at pain management. Dental pain was widespread and could be overwhelming. Spice oil was rubbed directly onto the gums. Spirit-soaked rags were held against the face. Some even used early versions of narcotics when accessible. But most endured quietly. The Queen couldn't postpone a state meeting because her teeth ached. She simply grinned through it or acted normal. Paintings from this period seldom reveal teeth. When mouths appear, they're shut, disciplined. The perfect aristocratic smile showed quiet dignity. Not because dignity was graceful, but because anything else exposed too much. A lost back tooth, a stained front tooth, an uneven bite. Better to keep the mouth closed and let the pearls speak instead. Some ladies used scarves or hand fans to cover their faces from certain views. Others stayed quiet entirely. If a courtier moved too close, there was a subtle retreat, a turn, a hand raised with a scented glove. It became a wordless choreography, guarding one's appearance, one's honour, one's rotting mouth, all while maintaining the pace of palace life. And yet, they persevered. They mastered how to smile without revealing teeth, how to talk without opening wide, how to chuckle behind a palm or a fan. Because in a society where everything was theatre, even a damaged mouth had to be handled with elegance. It's simple now to appreciate the breakthroughs of contemporary dentistry. Toothpaste, dental floss, and antibacterial mouthwash. But then, the choices were few. Discomfort was routine, decay was anticipated, and beauty meant acting. Acting like the teeth were fine. Acting like the smile still worked. So next time you clean your teeth, think about this. Think about the courtwoman holding a gem-decorated toothpick, the queen gargling with red wine, the servant scrubbing a wooden denture with a rag dipped in scented oil. They weren't reckless. They were trying their hardest with what they possessed in the world they inhabited. And next we'll shift from oral care to something even more extreme. The entire body. Because as much as they attempted to hide their skin with powder, they also tried to repair what they believed was broken inside. And that meant relying on medicine. The type that involved leeches, blades, and way too much blood. When cosmetics and fragrances could no longer mask what the body carried, and when smiles became too agonizing to fake, royal ladies turned to the one treatment they trusted might heal what lay under the skin. They turned to medicine, or more accurately, to what qualified as medicine in their era, an era where harmony was crucial and where imbalance had only one solution: drainage. Bloodletting was among the most frequent medical treatments used by royalty. It was prescribed for fevers, exhaustion, skin conditions, emotional problems, stomach troubles, and even depression. Nearly any complaint, if it remained mysterious, could be attributed to excess blood. The reasoning followed the old theory of the body's four fluids: blood, mucus, black bile, and yellow bile. To stay healthy meant keeping them balanced, and when blood appeared to dominate the others, it needed to be removed. The procedure was not discreet. It required sharp instruments, precise timing, and a surprising amount of ritual. Royal doctors didn't simply cut and pray. They employed decorated lancets, frequently crafted from silver or gold, sometimes etched with family emblems. These weren't merely medical devices, they were markers of power, of mastery, of skill. But regardless of how ornate the grip, the blade still broke skin. The site of the incision was important. The arm was typical, particularly near the elbow joint. The foot was chosen for specific conditions. In more severe instances, the neck or behind the ear. The selected location depended on what the doctor thought needed rebalancing, and frequently it depended on lunar cycles. Astrology held a quiet but steady influence in royal medicine. Poor planetary alignment might postpone the treatment. A positive one might encourage additional sessions. Royal women didn't always comply willingly, but they were required to submit, especially when symptoms became obvious. Swelling in the limbs, a stubborn rash, an abrupt personality change. These weren't just indicators of illness, they were alerts. Alerts that something internal had shifted, that the body, once peaceful and controlled, was now fighting back, and the doctor's duty was to restore order. To help the process, extra techniques were employed. Mustard poultices, vinegar wraps, heated rocks pressed against the skin to draw blood toward the surface. Once the blood began flowing, it was gathered in a bowl, examined, and frequently described thoroughly. Dense or thin, crimson or dark, rapid or slow. Each characteristic informed the physician something, or at least they thought it did. Sometimes the bloodletting helped, not because it eliminated the sickness, but because the patient felt more relaxed, steadier, the pain subsided briefly. Other times it made conditions worse. Removing too much blood meant fatigue, lightheadedness, collapse. But these results were seldom blamed on the method. They were viewed as unavoidable outcomes, evidence that the body had been corrected. And when blood wasn't sufficient, perspiration became the next route to recovery. The body, they assumed, could expel illness through skin pores. So women were bundled in multiple layers of fabric, positioned near flames and made to sweat for hours. Plants were burned close by to help. Basil, mint, rosemary. The atmosphere grew dense, the body grew wet. And still they stayed, waiting for the fever to end, for the balance to return. These sweating treatments were unpleasant, draining and sometimes degrading. But they were also confidential, conducted in bedrooms or private chambers, supervised by maids who had learned how to soothe without questioning. A woman finishing such treatment was frequently pale, weak, and somewhat bitter. But she powdered her skin, scented her hands, and rejoined court. As required, the more extravagant the court, the more extravagant the treatments. At Versailles, whole rooms were dedicated to bleeding and sweating. Wall hangings on the walls, pillows on the seats, perfumed water in silver containers. Everything was designed to make the disagreeable seem refined, to make sickness appear controllable, even normal. But it wasn't normal. For the women experiencing it, each session was a reminder that their bodies weren't theirs alone. They belonged to heritage, to duty, to the act of appearing healthy, even when sick. They didn't question if the treatment worked. They questioned if it was required, and once the physician agreed, everything else followed. Some women trusted completely in these ceremonies. They fasted beforehand, prayed throughout, expressed gratitude after. Others tolerated them with tight jaws and quiet anger. But despite personal beliefs, participation wasn't voluntary. A woman who declined treatment risked being called stubborn or, worse, mentally unstable. And so the blade stayed part of existence. So did the heat. So did the plants and the quiet. There are documents from this era that mention queens who bled monthly, not due to sickness, but because it was suggested as preventive care, like combing hair or cutting nails. The physician arrived, the bowl was readied, and another few ounces of blood joined the idea that health could be maintained through removal. It's simple to overlook now just how little was understood about the body. There were no microscopes in those chambers, no knowledge of germs or contamination, only patterns, observations, and the assumption that the body, if handled strictly, would cooperate. If it didn't, the fault was spiritual, not scientific. And if the Queen could bear it, so could everyone else. Her composed expression during bloodletting was seen as an example. Her silence during the sweating treatments was admired. Nobody mentioned the marks or the complications or the quiet weariness that came with constantly being treated, but never actually cured, because treatment, like everything else at court, was performance. It had to appear neat. It had to seem managed. And if that meant draining blood by candlelight with the smell of rosemary floating in the air, then that's what happened. But behind those scented fabrics and ceremonial instruments, the body kept its reality. It grew frail, it shook, it became tired of being balanced and fixed, and still it continued, because queens weren't allowed to break down. They were kept intact by routine, by obligation, and by the conviction that appearing healthy mattered more than actually being healthy. And next, we'll examine what occurred when the performance stretched beyond life, when beauty expectations followed royal women into death, and their bodies were prepared not for peace, but for exhibition. There was no actual conclusion to the act. Even after death, royal women were supposed to appear calm, pure, untainted. The instant breathing stopped, a different kind of preparation started, this time not for a celebration or a dance, but for something more lasting. The body would be observed, transported, viewed by nobles, diplomats, and occasionally the general public, and so it needed to be attractive, or at least not disturbing. Embalming wasn't unusual in royal circles. It was an established tradition. Not everyone agreed on the proper method, but everyone agreed it was necessary. The technique differed from nation to nation, and from one ruler to the next. but the objective was always to preserve what was left, hide what had changed, and never, ever allow the smell of decomposition to reach the silk drapes. The first step was cleaning, which came as an odd contradiction. Many royal women had spent most of their lives avoiding soap and water. Now, in death, their bodies were thoroughly washed, but not with regular soap. Instead, they were bathed in combinations of plants, oils, and wine. Lavender and rose were favourite options. Myrrh was employed in certain customs in richer courts. Scented alcohol was poured gently over the limbs, not only to cleanse, but to sanctify. After the washing came the stuffing. The body needed to be dried, and that required filling. Body cavities were packed with sawdust, plants, and sometimes cloth soaked in preservatives. In France, physicians used aromatic mixture made from spices and honey. In England, they occasionally used wax. The concept was not only preservation, it was management. No bloating, no collapse. Nothing that reminded the observer that this was no longer a breathing person. Cosmetics came next. Powder was spread on the face to even the skin colour. Rouge was applied to the cheeks. Lips were occasionally coloured. If the skin had grown dark or bruised, it was covered with fabric or patches. Wigs were positioned. Hands were placed precisely, and the eyes, if not stitched closed, were shut carefully and held gently to create the appearance of peace. Clothing was selected deliberately. It needed to show dignity, rank, and gentleness. Some queens were buried in official gowns, others in plain white linen, but always with attention to detail. Embroidery, gems, gloves, rings. The body wasn't just being buried, it was being displayed, and every detail counted. The coffin was frequently more elaborate than the bed the woman had used in life. Velvet interior, polished wood, silver decoration, display. In some instances, it was open for days, positioned on view in a cold chapel, watched by servants carrying candles. People arrived to show respect. They bowed. They murmured. They examined the face for evidence of serenity or divine judgment. Nobody admitted to searching for the powder, but everyone knew it was present. Some queens had specific directions for their after-death care. Wills that outlined how they wished to be dressed, what fragrances should be applied, even who was permitted to handle them. These weren't about vanity. They concerned reputation. The final impression mattered. For some, it mattered more than anything else. And underneath all the ceremony was a quiet reality. These preparations weren't only for the deceased. They were for the survivors. To comfort them, to calm them, to remind them that even in death structure continued, that the royal body, though lifeless, was still sacred, still flawless, still maintained by the same standards it had followed while alive. But not everything could be concealed in hot weather. The embalming didn't always work. There are reports of queens whose bodies needed re-rouging, whose lips required retouching before each viewing. One particularly disturbing account describes the odour seeping into the corners of a cathedral, forcing the guards to change every hour. Another tells of a veil being placed hurriedly over the face halfway through a procession. Still, nobody spoke. They bowed. They walked. They held their breath and praised her beauty. Because death, like everything else at court, had its script, and nobody wanted to forget their role. Behind the locked doors of preparation chambers, maids and medicine makers worked silently. They adjusted the folds, they reapplied fragrance, they replaced the dying flowers on the chest. No applause awaited them, no acknowledgement, but their work shaped the memory that would endure. Sometimes keepsakes were collected. A piece of hair, a bit of lace, a glove. These items were cherished, stored in small containers and handed down not as reminders of affection always, but as proof of having been close, of having touched something significant, something preserved. And when the funeral concluded and the body was finally placed into the tomb, The scent lingered in the chamber, in the clothing of the attendants, on the pages of letters written that week. It stayed longer than expected, as if to suggest that beauty, once applied, didn't surrender easily. Even centuries later, when royal graves are opened for research, evidence of these ceremonies are discovered. Pieces of fabric still contain the smell of spices. Hair still holds wax. Rings are still positioned on fingers that were arranged with care. And the face, even if sunken, still displays the traces of rouge applied long ago. It seems strange, maybe, to imagine a queen being powdered after death, to picture her cheeks being tinted by a maid with shaking hands. But in the reasoning of court life, it made complete sense. The body was never just a body. It was a symbol, a container, a reflection of authority. So the ceremonies continued. Not from superstition, not from fear, but from habit, from duty, and maybe, just maybe, from love. Next, we will return to the world of the living, where ceremonies were still part of everyday life, and where privacy for a royal woman was often just a curtain and a hope. Privacy was a scarce commodity for royal women. Nearly everything they did was watched, discussed, and meticulously documented. From how they entered a chamber to how they sat at meals, every action held significance. But when it came to personal cleanliness, that same scrutiny became a hardship, because even the most intimate bodily needs had to be managed under the observant gaze of the court. And behind the screen, so to speak, there was very little room to relax. The royal bedroom was never truly private. It was a performance space decorated with fine linens, flickering candles, and a row of waiting attendants. Each woman had a schedule, and each schedule required assistance. Getting dressed, getting undressed, preparing for bed, even washing when it occurred was a team activity. The Queen did not bring her own water. She did not carry her own towel. And when she was done, she did not empty the basin. For most royal women, the best they could expect was a folding partition, something tall enough to hide part of the view, but not so large that it blocked the room behind it. They could bathe, or, more commonly, pat themselves with scented cloths. These cloths were prepared beforehand, soaked in flower waters or diluted vinegar. They were warm when applied, sometimes scented with rose, sometimes with lavender. The process was not vigorous. It was gentle, a kind of careful dabbing, enough to remove surface grime, not enough to disturb what lay beneath. The cloths were not laundered after every use. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they were aired, hung over chairs or window ledges, left outside for the wind to refresh them, then folded and returned to the dresser. By morning, servants understood this rhythm. They knew what to prepare and when to prepare it, and most of the time they remained silent. Silence was expected. Silence was professional. Even so, errors occurred. A servant entered too early. A maid dropped the wrong cloths. A partition shifted. In those instances, everyone stopped. The atmosphere grew tense. And then, just as suddenly, the act continued. A soft apology, a look away, a distraction provided, perhaps a topic change, because dignity had to be maintained, even if only in pieces. The real difficulty arose during travel. Moving from castle to castle meant adapting to new chambers, new staff, and often inferior conditions. Privacy vanished almost entirely. Royal carriages were not pleasant. They were tight, noisy, and slow. Stops were rare. When nature demanded, the options were limited. A lady in waiting would hold a cloth, another would block the view with a fan. The chamber pot might be hidden under the bench. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked directly. The Queen would emerge, composed. The pot would vanish. Life continued in larger palaces, small. Some attempts were made to create personal space, alcoves, side chambers, even enclosed closets, but these were shared by many, and they were not always sanitary. The odour remained, The stone floors stayed cold, and the water, when it arrived, was never quite warm enough. So many women avoided the process entirely. Better to apply perfume than to risk discomfort. Better to add another undergarment than to remove the one already worn. Undergarments were seen as part of the answer. Made of linen, they were thought to soak up sweat and protect the outer layers. They were worn for days, sometimes weeks, without cleaning. When removed, they were aired, not scrubbed. Stains were brushed away. Spots were treated with herbs. Only in extreme cases were they soaked, and even then, carefully. No boiling, no harsh soap, just patience and sunlight. The theory was that natural fibres, if exposed to fresh air, would clean themselves. So the windows stayed open. Clothes hung near them. Scented pouches were tucked inside sleeves and bodices. Lavender was popular, rosemary, sometimes lemon rind. It helped, but not completely. The smell of worn garments lingered, and no partition could hide that entirely. For those who could afford it, new garments were constantly being created. A chemise for travel, another for celebrations, another for mourning. But not everyone replaced items regularly. Some women grew fond of familiar pieces. They adjusted hems, patched tiers, and added lace to hide wear. The appearance of freshness was maintained, even when the fabric had long since lost its brightness. And through it all, the servants stayed present, holding towels, smoothing wrinkles, lighting fires, preparing the scented cloths without remark. Their presence was steady, their hands were sure, their eyes downcast. They were part of the environment, but not the narrative. Until something went wrong. A dizzy spell, a dropped basin, a reaction to perfume. In those moments, the illusion broke and the reality of being human returned. Quickly, someone moved forward. A maid caught the stumble. Another whispered directions. A third offered a cloth. Within moments, the court resumed. The partition reset. The Queen smiled, and all was forgotten. It's tempting to picture these women as spoiled, surrounded by help, free from work. But the reality was more complex. To live without privacy is to live without rest. Every movement is calculated, every action practiced. There was no space to be exhausted, no room to be sick. Only the routine and the hope that nobody noticed when it faltered. Even letters from the time reveal how uncommon solitude was. Queens wrote of craving quiet, of wanting space, of desiring time alone. Some escaped to gardens, others to prayer. But the world followed. The expectations never ceased, and the partition, no matter how thick, could not block everything. So they learned to accept it, to use the partition as both protection and stage, to make the rituals appear graceful, to hide discomfort with poise, and to treasure each moment of stillness as precious. Next, we will explore how royal women dressed not just for style, but for purpose. How every layer, every lace, and every fastener served a function. Not always a pleasant one, but always intentional. Getting dressed was never straightforward. For royal women, putting on clothing was more like an engineering project than a simple task. It demanded layers, strategy, and help. Every piece had its purpose. Some layers provided structure, others absorbed moisture. A few were purely ornamental, but even those played their role in maintaining appearances. Comfort, as always, wasn't the goal. The aim was control of the body, of the image, of what could be revealed and what had to be concealed. The first layer was typically linen, a chemise or shift, soft enough to touch the skin, but strong enough to last through repeated wearing. This layer caught most of the sweat and body oils. It was the garment least likely to be laundered frequently, yet closest to the skin. Over time, the fabric yellowed, it softened, it moulded itself to the body it covered. Some women owned dozens, others depended on a few trusted pieces, but all of them considered this layer vital, even if it rarely showed. Next came the stays or corset. Reinforced with whalebone or stiffened with cane, this piece pressed the body into proper shape. Not just a narrower waist, but better posture, raised chest, and firm silhouette. Wearing it was mandatory. It marked the difference between private and public, between waking and being presentable. Lacing it required assistance. Tightening it took effort. Loosening it, even momentarily, was considered self-indulgent. Most women wore it from dawn until dusk. After the corset came the petticoats, sometimes one, frequently two or three. They created fullness. They smoothed contours. They prevented outer garments from clinging too tightly. In cold seasons, they provided insulation. In warm seasons, they trapped heat. Still, they were worn because without them, the dress would not hang properly. The weight was part of the design. The dress itself varied by period and region. Some laced in front, others buttoned in back. Sleeves were frequently detachable, tied on with ribbons or sewn into place. The fabric might be velvet, brocade, silk or wool. Lighter materials for spring, heavier ones for winter, but all substantial, all luxurious, all difficult to clean, which meant they were seldom washed and regularly perfumed. Each outfit was chosen thoughtfully. Colour was significant. Style was significant. Decorations were significant. A dress with pearls sewn into the seams communicated something. So did a design of gold thread. So did the number of buttons, the arrangement of lace and the length of the train. Nothing was random. Even mourning attire, intended to be modest, followed rigid rules. Black for a queen, grey for a relative, purple for a child. Each thread had regulations. Accessories finished the look. Gloves, often perfumed. A fan always within reach. A small bag for herbs or talismans. Jewellery, naturally, played a part. Necklaces, earrings, brooches. Not just for beauty, but for communicating status. A borrowed emerald might start rumours. A missing brooch might create questions. Everything worn was observed. Everything had meaning. Hair had its system, usually pinned up, usually covered. Wigs were standard, especially when natural hair had become thin or been damaged by powder and pomade. Certain wigs were basic. Others rose like elaborate monuments of spirals, plaits, and decorations. They demanded constant care. They drew bugs. They needed careful storage, gentle brushing, and occasional complete replacement. But women wore them because they completed the look. Footwear stayed hidden, yet always present. Satin slippers, hide boots, decorated flats. Not always sensible, not always pleasant, but always essential to the costume. Hosiery was secured with ties, layer upon layer. Nothing was random. All of this consumed hours. Getting dressed might stretch beyond an hour, and that was with help, with assistance. A lady-in-waiting supported the sleeves. Another tightened the bodice. A third brought the jewellery. The Queen remained standing, or occasionally seated, while the routine played out around her. Conversation was sparse. Motion was restricted. Each person understood their role. Once clothed, the lady was meant to remain that way. No informal changes, no relaxing in partial dress, unless sickness required it. She stayed in complete attire until evening arrived, which meant sitting rigidly, moving with caution, dining delicately. Every motion was dictated by the garments themselves, and beneath it all, the flesh reacted. It perspired, it expanded, it irritated, but little could be done. Scratching was improper, readjusting was clumsy, so pain became routine, constriction became known. The heaviness of the dress, the restriction of the stays, the warmth of the fabric, it was all expected. Some ladies bore it more easily than others. Some grew light-headed, others broke out in skin problems. Still others took to collapsing, not from anxiety, but from poor blood flow. Yet they persisted, because removing clothes was even more complex, and because images, once created, needed maintenance. When night fell, the routine reversed. Jewellery came off, strings loosened. Pins got gathered in dishes. Dresses were lifted overhead or stepped out of carefully. The inner layers, wet with the day's strain, were ventilated, sometimes wiped, seldom washed. Bodies received fresh powder. Undergarments were adjusted, sleeping clothes put on, and the following day, everything started over. It might seem extreme, and in many respects it was, but to the ladies experiencing it, this was standard. This was required. Dressing wasn't simply about covering flesh. It was about moulding the individual, declaring rank, concealing imperfections, displaying authority. Even a monarch who controlled a realm had to submit to style. She had to wear what custom required. She had to perspire under silk while acting like she didn't feel it. She had to walk in narrow shoes, breathe through a corset, and grin under a powdered hairpiece, all without protest. Because protesting would draw attention. And attention at court was always risky. Moving forward, we'll examine those hairpieces more closely, how they were constructed, how they were cared for, and what occurred when creatures found their way into them. The hairpiece for numerous noble ladies was more than just a fix. It was a declaration, a method to manage their appearance even when the body below it started to fail them. Hair loss, patchy growth, bare spots from tight bindings or scalp conditions could all be hidden under layers of curls and fullness. And once hairpieces became standard court wear, they weren't just anticipated, they were mandatory. Most hairpieces used human strands. Some came from volunteers, others were bought or gathered through less clear methods. In certain instances, whole communities were known to shave their scalps in return for payment. The gathered hair was sorted by shade, feel and length. Golden hair was treasured. Auburn was stylish in some palaces. Dark was uncommon. The strands were cleaned, dried and stitched onto a mesh foundation, sometimes hardened with wax, sometimes built over wire for support. A completed hairpiece could require weeks to create and hours to arrange. Once finished, the hairpiece needed maintenance. It was combed, dusted, and scented. Hair dust was a blend of starch, grain powder, and perfumed oils. Spread by hand or with a brush, it produced a soft, light covering that gave the hairpiece its distinctive appearance. But dust wasn't gentle on the head. It blocked skin openings. It aggravated the surface. It hung in the atmosphere, settled on fabric, and left behind a smell that mixed blossoms with flower and something else nobody acknowledged. Still, ladies wore them with pride. Some hairpieces were humble, others reached ridiculous proportions, woven with strips, gems, and even tiny figurines. One fashion featured miniature vessels riding waves of hair complete with canvas and poles. Another included small landscapes with fabric flowers and fake birds. It was style as performance, but it was also weighty. A fully decorated hairpiece could weigh multiple pounds. Wearing it demanded good posture. Wearing it throughout the day demanded endurance. Below the hairpiece, the head didn't always manage well. The natural hair was braided severely or removed. The scalp was infrequently cleaned. Moisture gathered. Dust drifted down and collected against the skin. Over time, this created ideal conditions for parasites and tiny insects. Some ladies scratched endlessly. Others applied additional dust. A few disregarded the issue completely until it became obvious. Then the hairpiece was burned and a replacement was commissioned. Cleaning a hairpiece wasn't straightforward. Washing it was dangerous. Water dissolved the animal grease used for styling. Heat ruined the framework. Dampness encouraged mould. So instead of washing, most hairpieces were refreshed, combed, dusted, repowdered. If scent faded, more was applied. If the curls lost form, pins were inserted. If nothing else worked, it was discarded. Some ladies had complete collections of hairpieces. One for court, one for strolls, one for grief, one for paintings. Each was labelled, kept on cushioned forms, and used in turn. Servants were taught to handle them carefully, to adjust positioning, to secure fastenings, to brush out knots without pulling too forcefully. It was both art and daily theatre. Naturally, not everyone had equal access. Some ladies wore hairpieces, others inherited old ones from elderly relatives. These tended to have additional issues. They molted, they moved, they retained odours, but they were still used because appearing without a hairpiece was unacceptable. It suggested weakness, it suggested exposure. And for royal ladies, those weren't possibilities. There are accounts of ladies fainting from the weight, others had constant headaches. But they powdered their skin, attached their jewellery, and raised their heads. Because the hairpiece wasn't just about appearance, it was about meeting expectations, about fitting into a world where everything had to appear managed, even pain had to look elegant. Parasites, when found, became everyone's problem, not just for the wearer, but for all nearby. Special combs were employed, scented powders were used, cloth caps were worn overnight. In some palaces, entire mornings were spent examining hairpieces for signs of infestation. If the invasion was severe, the answer was fire. There's one account from a Spanish court where a queen's preferred hairpiece began to shift during a dinner. Tiny creatures had collected along the edge, emerging one by one as the evening progressed. She maintained her expression, nodded graciously, and completed the meal. The hairpiece was disposed of after midnight and destroyed. Nobody spoke of it afterward. That, also, was part of the act. Even so, the truth was understood. Behind the polished glass and golden details, every lady knew what might be lurking just above her brow. The pain, the warmth, the irritation. And yet they continued. Because removing the hairpiece meant removing the image, and that wasn't permitted. Hair thinning became more frequent as ladies aged, some from disease, some from constant tension, others from the chemicals in their cosmetics and fragrances. But a complete head of styled hair remained the expectation, so hairpieces grew denser, higher, more complex, hiding more, revealing less. Today, hairpieces are chosen voluntarily for appearance, for pleasure, for fashion. But in those palaces they were more like protection, designed to shield what was delicate, to hide what time had claimed, to maintain the fantasy. And like all aspects of royal cleanliness, they were cared for with determination, with instruments, with fragrance, with quiet. Moving ahead will change our attention from what was displayed to what lay beneath, not the skin, but the atmosphere, the warmth, the perspiration that occurred behind the silk and under the jewellery. Because staying cool wasn't always achievable. And acting comfortable became a constant performance. Under all the fabric, beneath the bodice, behind the powder and the hairpiece, the body did what bodies naturally do. It heated, it moved, it sweated. And in the enclosed areas of royal existence, with thick materials, flame light and poor airflow, sweat was more than a personal problem. It was a perpetual struggle, one that royal ladies had to handle without revealing it was there. Perspiring wasn't considered acceptable, not for noble ladies. It was linked with work, with farmers and workers, with people who laboured in the sun and had no alternatives. A lady glistening at a banquet or touching her throat during a ritual was, theoretically, impossible. But reality was less cooperative. Palaces were packed, dance halls filled rapidly, churches were warm and serious, dresses were heavy, bodices restrictive, and the air remained motionless. Most castles had no cooling methods, wide windows helped but barely, wall hangings hung on walls to retain warmth. Heavy carpets covered stone surfaces, fires burned constantly in draughty spaces. In summer, the heat accumulated slowly, building in rooms filled with people and smoke. In winter, it remained trapped inside fur and fabric. Regardless, the outcome was identical: sweat. But acknowledging it was different entirely. Ladies carried scented fabric to dab their skin. Fans were used continuously, fluttering not just for appearance but for necessity. Some carried dried plants in their gloves or stitched small packets of herbs into the seams of their garments. The goal was to absorb the moisture, mask the smell and preserve the image. Bodices made it worse. They pressed into the skin, capturing heat. They allowed no space for air to move. The boning dug into the ribs, maintained posture straight, and made full breathing difficult. Underneath, linen undergarments soaked through, sticking to the back and chest. But nobody mentioned this. Ladies stood, smiled and acted, always acting. At palace events, movement was restricted. Walking slowly, sitting for extended periods, standing in position during rituals that continued into the night. All in formal dress, all under watch. If a lady became red-faced, someone provided a fan. If her hand shook, someone offered drink. But perspiring openly would have been thought vulgar. So they suffered, silently. Servants understood what to look for. They saw the damp edges of trim, the reddened faces, the sleeves touched too often. They prepared items in advance. Cool water scented with herbs, cloth folded twice for discretion. The queen might withdraw to a private corner, pat at her throat, reapply powder and return. But the discomfort didn't disappear. It simply accompanied her back into the space. Some ladies developed methods, powdering between garments, changing linen midday, using vinegar rinses to cool the skin before dressing. Others soaked plants in wine and pressed the mixture into their underarms. A few burned herbs in small containers beneath their vanity tables, hoping the smell would attach to their bodies. These remedies helped, but only marginally. In certain cases, sweat was considered a sickness. If it became extreme, doctors were summoned. Diagnoses ranged from overheating of the blood to spiritual imbalance. Treatments included additional layers, more plants, sometimes even bloodletting to release the hot humours. None of it addressed the basic fact that the body wrapped in excessive cloth under excessive pressure would perspire. The issue extended to the bedding. Down mattresses soaked in summer linen sheets yellowed with age. Covers trapped the heat of the day. Washing these items was uncommon. More commonly, they were aired out, draped over rails or windows, scented with plants, sprinkled with powder. But the smell of old sweat didn't fade easily. It remained, especially in the private chambers behind the public areas. The fantasy dropped somewhat. The air grew heavier. Some queens had their approaches. Elizabeth of Austria, for instance, kept her chambers as cool as achievable. She required fresh bedding daily. She exercised early in the morning and powdered heavily before appearing. Others ordered scented burners to burn in corners. The smoke concealed more than it aided, but it provided the impression of freshness. Naturally, none of this addressed the skin itself. Rubbing was frequent. Rashes emerged in summer. Fungal problems were quietly addressed with ointments. Maids understood how to blend pastes, how to arrange cloth to prevent friction, how to comfort without attracting notice. Nobody discussed it, but everyone understood. Even the seating at court reflected this reality. Cushioned seats covered in silk retained warmth. After hours of sitting, they were damp. Servants were quick to switch cushions, to spray them with flower water, to act as if they hadn't been soaked. But the reality was difficult to dismiss. One diplomat visiting a summer celebration in France wrote of the air being dense enough to taste. He complimented the gowns, the music, and the decorations. But, at the conclusion, he included a single sentence. He had never witnessed so many ladies fan themselves with such desperation. That was as near to truth as his letter permitted. And still the ladies smiled. They walked in gowns lined with wet linen. They held hands dusted with powder. They danced until sunrise, skin chafed under layers, because that was what was demanded, expected elegance without effort, beauty without sweat, even when it was impossible. Today, we discuss self-care, of breathable materials, of comfort and wellness. But in those palaces, comfort was thought weakness. Sweat was a mistake. The body, if handled properly, was supposed to remain silent, dry, managed. So they layered, powdered, perfumed, and endured. They smiled through damp sleeves. They nodded with flushed faces. They learned to disregard the smell or to call it something different. Moving forward, we will examine more closely what they wore underneath everything, the garments that contacted the skin, that carried the burden of the body, and that were, more often than not, never truly washed. The clothes that rested nearest to the skin had one purpose. They were designed to shield the outer layers, to soak up sweat, to gather the dust, oil, and everything else a royal lady's body generated over long hours in restrictive clothing. These were the undergarments, simple linen shifts, underskirts, drawers when they were used, and bodices lined with cotton or wool. They formed the silent base of the grand display, and they were seldom properly washed. Unlike the velvet and silk that attracted attention, these pieces weren't for show. They were rarely visible. Hidden beneath bodices and gowns, they existed to bear the burden of the day. A linen chemise might be worn from dawn until dusk, soaking up everything that bodice and dress refused to absorb. Afterwards it would be hung in the fresh air, not washed, not scrubbed, just aired. The reasoning was straightforward. Water, when applied too frequently, was thought to harm the material. Soap was considered rough. The sun and wind, however, were trusted friends. Maids would bring the clothes to a window or, if feasible, to a secluded courtyard. They would shake them out softly, sprinkle them with flower water, and hang them until dried. Then they would fold the garments carefully and return them to their spot, ready for the next day. Washing occurred, but not regularly. It demanded time, fuel, heat, space to dry, and it carried risks. Boiling could contract the material, scrubbing could wear it fragile, so royal homes established a limit. A noticeable stain might qualify, so might a smell that travelled too far. But most of the time, undergarments were rotated, not cleaned. One chemise in service, another airing, a third saved for important days, and a fourth waiting for mending. Mending was frequent. Seams split, edges wore. Sweat discoloured the underarms and the lower back. The maids stitched where necessary. Patches were applied. Discoloration was hidden with embroidery. Lace edging could disguise damage. A skilled servant could extend the life of a single undergarment for years, particularly if nobody ever examined it closely. Some queens had preferences. Elizabeth preferred fine linen. She demanded it to be changed frequently, at least more than most. But even then, the change didn't always mean cleaning. A shift might move from the body to the air, then back again, folded, smoothed, freshened with lavender, but never touched by hot water. There were theories behind this. Some thought that linen, being a natural material, cleaned itself with air. Others believed that frequent washing weakened the cloth's ability to protect, and still others simply accepted the rhythm because it had always been so. Their mothers had done it, their grandmothers too, and so the pattern persisted. These garments were not light, especially when layered. Some shifts had long sleeves, some had fitted necklines, they rubbed at the throat, they bunched at the waist. In summer they stuck to the skin. In winter they trapped moisture under wool. And yet they remained on all day under everything else, only removed at night if the lady was fortunate enough to sleep alone at night. The shift was sometimes replaced with a nightgown, but not always. Some ladies slept in the same linen they had worn during the day, especially when travelling, especially when sick, especially when dressing again in the morning was too much effort. The cloth grew warm, then stale, then bitter. But it stayed because habits once formed were difficult to change. There's a kind of silent absurdity in all of this. A queen might wear a dress trimmed in gold, a necklace of pearls, shoes stitched by hand. But beneath it all she wore a shift that hadn't seen soap in weeks, and nobody mentioned it, nobody dared, as long as the scent remained within the folds and the cloth didn't show at the edges. The fantasy held. Servants paid the real price. They handled the garments, folded them, carried them, smelled them. They learned to hold the cloth at arm's length, to press the scented plants with extra care, to praise the embroidery instead of noticing the stain. Their job wasn't just to clean, it was to protect the fantasy and themselves. Even now, a few pieces of these undergarments survive, stored in museums, studied by scholars. They show wear, they show staining, they tell the silent truth of royal life, that no matter how many layers were added, the skin underneath behaved the same, and the cloth nearest to it told that story better than any painting ever could. Some garments were kept after death, stored with care, labelled and boxed, not because they were lovely, but because they had touched the body. They became artifacts of routine, symbols of daily life, not gems, not crowns, but folded linen with a history of its own. It's easy to forget how personal these layers were, how closely they held the body, how quietly they did their work. They carried the weight of sweat, of scent, of pressure. They absorbed the discomfort that gowns tried to hide, and they asked for nothing in return, only a little air, a little patience, a little space to rest. But even these quiet layers weren't safe from scrutiny. If a chemise showed from under a gown, it had to be clean. If the lace at the collar turned yellow, it had to be replaced. Appearance mattered, even in the smallest details. And moving ahead, we will follow one of the most awkward aspects of royal cleanliness, the one that couldn't be perfumed, stitched or powdered, the one that came once a month quietly, uninvited and full of inconvenience. There was one visitor that no queen could dismiss. It arrived monthly, stayed uninvited, and brought with it a level of discomfort that even the finest lace couldn't hide. Menstruation wasn't a subject for palace conversation, not even whispered among ladies unless absolutely necessary. Yet it was as real as the throne. And royal ladies, despite their position, had to face it with limited resources, little privacy, and a great deal of silence. In the early modern era, menstrual care was a combination of folklore, improvised solutions, and trial by discomfort. There were no manufactured products, no soft cotton pads, no elastic bands or discreet packaging. Instead, women used cloth rags, often linen folded into thick layers. These cloths were held in place by strings or ties, if at all. Sometimes they were simply tucked into place, relying on the weight of skirts and the stiffness of bodices to keep everything where it needed to be. These rags had a term. They were often called monthly cloths. They were washed and reused, though rarely with any real effectiveness. The washing process was awkward. Water had to be heated. Soap was harsh and costly. Blood left marks that never fully vanished. So most of the time the cloths were rinsed, squeezed out, and hung discreetly behind shutters or in the servants' areas, away from noble eyes. And yet everyone knew the maids handled the cloths. They noticed when their lady needed assistance walking or sat with more care. They noticed when fresh sheets were requested, more than once in a week. They noticed the signs, even if nothing was spoken aloud. The entire system operated on silent cooperation. The discomfort was constant. Even the best cloths shifted out of position. They rubbed against the skin. They trapped heat and moisture. Irritation and infection were common risks, though never discussed as such. If a lady developed a rash or fever, it might be blamed on bad air or spoiled food. Rarely did anyone connect it back to the same cloth being used repeatedly with only a rinse in between. There were other approaches, though not all reliable. Some women used wool, or even soft moss packed into linen. Others tried sponges soaked in wine or vinegar, hoping for cleanliness, or at least to mask the smell. A few records mention women sitting over herbs or ashes, hoping the heat and smoke would cleanse the body. Most of these solutions caused more problems than they solved. Privacy was limited. Even queens shared chambers. Servants entered frequently. There was no lock on the door, no time alone to manage pain or discomfort. When cramps arrived, there were no medications, no hot water bottles. Some women pressed heated bricks to their stomachs. Others drank herbal teas or took to bed. But rest was a luxury. Life at court didn't pause for blood. Staining was the greatest fear. A red mark on a gown, a seat cushion, or a bedsheet could damage a reputation. It was seen as a failure, as carelessness, as something improper, so women took great care to hide any trace. They wore extra layers. They folded the cloth 3 or 4 times. They sat on folded shawls. Some even stitched dark patches into the underside of their skirts to mask the inevitable. And yet, accidents occurred. Servants knew how to spot them and remove evidence quickly. A stained seat would be flipped over. A gown would be rushed to the repair room. A lady might vanish for an hour, only to return in a different dress, powdered and quiet. No explanation offered, none expected. There was shame connected to this cycle, even though it was natural. It reminded everyone that the female body didn't always behave politely, that it had needs, that it couldn't be fully controlled by manners or lace. So it was tucked away, hidden under perfume and silence, managed behind curtains and within tight schedules. Even doctors were uncertain what to say. Some claimed that menstrual blood was corrupt, dangerous. It carried toxins. The women were unclean during their cycle. Others believed it was a form of balance, a way to release excess heat. Neither view led to helpful solutions, and neither gave women comfort. Instead, the burden remained personal. Pain was endured with clenched teeth. Stains were scrubbed away in corners. Linen was folded tightly and stored out of sight. When the cycle ended, there was a brief sense of relief. Not joy, just quiet gratitude that the worst had passed. Until next time. It's tempting now to look back with disbelief, to wonder how women survived. But they did, because there was no other choice. They created their systems. They trained their daughters and their maids. They passed down techniques, even if none of them truly worked. And they did all of this while smiling, dancing, sitting in court for hours, pretending that nothing was out of the ordinary. Men knew naturally. Some turned their heads, others made jokes in private, but most simply looked the other way, pretending that their queen didn't bleed, that their duchess never stained a cushion, that women were somehow clean by nature. It was simpler that way. The illusion persisted beautifully, yet reality lurked beneath the surface, hidden in creased fabrics, concealed stains and grimaces masked by silk fans. Palace life was far from pristine. It was orchestrated meticulously, frantically, often agonizingly. And now we venture to that one sanctuary where all sought comfort, yet frequently discovered something entirely different, the royal restroom. In a castle so vast, so brimming with secrets and gowns and gold, you'd expect the royal bathroom to offer refuge, a haven of sorts, a moment of solitude in an existence that seldom permitted any. But truthfully, it provided no such comfort, not even remotely. The royal restroom, across all its many forms, served more as symbol than sanitation. It embodied hierarchy, status and custom, but rarely relief. Most castles featured what they termed garderobes. These were compact stone chambers constructed within the massive exterior walls, with a narrow opening carved from timber or stone. The waist plunged down a vertical chute, occasionally into a moat, occasionally onto bare earth below. No flushing existed, no cleaning mechanism, and no protection, merely an opening and gravity. During winter, the seat felt cold enough to sting. During summer, the stench drifted back up the chute with an assertiveness that no fragrance could conquer. Royal ladies didn't always utilize these directly. In the most ceremonial courts, such as Elizabeth I's, a particular position existed. They called it the keeper of the wardrobe, or, more personally, the chamber lady. Among their numerous duties, one involved overseeing the Queen's bathroom needs. It was deemed an honour, an intimate, trusted role, yet the work itself was far from dignified, Portable chamber vessels were frequently employed instead. They were crafted from pewter, brass, or porcelain for those with such privilege. These vessels were brought into the bedchamber, sometimes concealed behind a partition, sometimes openly. A servant would assist in removing the clothing layers. She would support them, preventing them from dragging or overturning the vessel. Privacy didn't exist, only protocol afterward. The vessel was covered and taken away. Its destination varied by castle. Some maintained a designated waste room. Others simply directed servants to empty the contents into gardens, into streams, or into corners designated for refuse. The vessel was rinsed, not always completely, then returned to position. Odours were inevitable. Naturally they were. The vessel might be scented with herbs, rosemary, lavender, and mint, yet it rarely made a difference. The stench of decay and human waste proved too powerful. It attached to the atmosphere, to the stone surfaces, to the skirts of those who passed too close. Ventilation was non-existent, perhaps a window if fortune allowed, often too small to help. Then there was the question of frequency. A lady might need the vessel several times daily, particularly during sickness, particularly when expecting. Yet each occasion demanded assistance, demanded timing, demanded coordination with her attendants. If someone was delayed or distracted or unwell themselves, the entire process stalled and discomfort intensified. Even more challenging were the ceremonial occasions, dances, feasts, and public displays. A royal gown could require 30 minutes to remove. It wasn't designed for haste, so many ladies avoided excessive drinking. They conditioned their bodies, they prayed the urge wouldn't arrive until after the ceremony. If it did, they suffered quietly, carefully. Some discovered methods. They used footstools for stability. They raised only the essential layers. They whispered to their maid before the signal was even necessary. Yet none of it made the process less degrading, simply more routine. In France, they claimed that courtiers occasionally relieved themselves behind tapestries during extended receptions. The floor was covered in rushes, which absorbed more than merely spilled wine. Whether this occurred in the English court remains disputed, yet the principle stands. There were limited suitable options. Cleanliness was always comparative. The chamber vessels were reused, the garderobes were seldom emptied, flies were abundant, so were stains on the stone flooring. The air remained thick, constantly perfume was applied, herbs were ground, doors stayed shut. Yet the truth never remained concealed for long. The Queen herself had minimal control in this. She followed the routine established by generations prior. She depended on her ladies. She held her breath. She sat or knelt or stood, depending on the structure. And she remained silent, because dignity wasn't about fragrance. It was about silence. Some visitors were appalled. Foreign diplomats noted the absence of cleanliness. They composed letters home, describing the smell, the peculiar customs, the exposed waste areas. Yet in court, they bowed, they smiled, they breathed through their silk handkerchiefs. The irony was profound. The wealthiest people in the nation possessed the worst plumbing. Their gowns were embroidered with gold, yet they crouched over vessels like commoners. Their halls resonated with music, but also with the scraping of buckets and the clanging of chamber lids. Still, nobody objected. Not permitted. The court proceeded. Buckets were cleared. Stone floors were cleaned with vinegar. Chamber vessels were concealed behind curtains. And everyone pretended to believe that everything smelled perfectly fine. Today, we look back and admire the gowns, the gems, the decorated ceilings. We overlook the chamber vessels, the cold stone seats, the quiet, frantic dance of bodily necessity. Yet it was there, always, behind every curtain, beneath every throne. Now we turn to the mouth, the royal smile, the teeth that sparkled in portraits, yet told a vastly different story in reality. Royal portraits frequently display flawless faces, smooth complexion, pink cheeks, a calm expression suggesting wisdom and composure. And somewhere near the bottom of the painting, a subtle smile, a mouth that appears peaceful, almost kind. Yet the truth behind that smile was seldom pleasant. Royal teeth were hardly the pearl-white wonders those paintings implied. They were often the complete opposite. Let's start with the fundamentals. Dental care in the early modern era was more speculation than knowledge. Toothbrushes, if they existed whatsoever, weren't the soft, bristled implements we recognise today. Some ladies used frayed twigs, gently chewed at one end until they created a sort of brush. Others wrapped cloth around a finger, dipped it in wine or vinegar, and scrubbed it against the teeth. It was superior to nothing, yet only marginally. Tooth powder was accessible in certain circles, made from crushed herbs, burned bread, salt, or even powdered bones. It promised freshness and shine. In reality, it scraped at the enamel and left gums bleeding. Royal ladies used it because they needed to appear refined, yet each application caused some pain. Over time, it caused more damage than benefit. Then came the diet, rich in sugar, especially for the affluent. Sugar imported from distant lands was a treasured luxury, and the royal court had abundance. Candied fruits, spiced wine, sweetened meat, sauces. Even medications were combined with sugar. And, as sugar intake increased, so did tooth decay. Slowly, silently, until one day the pain emerged. Toothaches were frequent, cavities went untreated, gums became inflamed, breath turned foul. Yet nobody spoke a word. A queen couldn't wince. A duchess couldn't excuse herself mid-banquet to rest in agony. Instead, they took herbs, chewed on cloves, pressed cold cloths to their faces, or simply endured. If a tooth required extraction, it was done swiftly, without warning, without anything resembling pain relief. An iron instrument was inserted, twisted, and pulled. The crack resonated, the blood flowed, the screams were muffled, and afterward the Queen still had to smile, perhaps with lips sealed, perhaps with one side turned slightly from the crowd. There were artificial teeth also, made from bone or ivory, or borrowed, quite literally, from the mouths of the destitute. Dentures were carved, wired together and forced into place. They didn't fit properly. They created sores. They moved when speaking. Yet they appeared better than a gap-toothed smile. And in portraits, that was all that counted. The mouth was a war zone, not only due to decay, but also because of infection. Abscesses developed. Jaws expanded. Sometimes the pain spread to the ear or the eye. Physicians applied leeches or pierced the gum with a heated needle. These were the finest solutions available. Despite all this, the court still prized appearance. A pleasant smile was part of the authority. So the royal ladies powdered their lips. They dabbed fragrance along the jawline. They angled their heads in portraits to conceal the worst side. And they trained themselves to speak without moving their mouths excessively. You could learn much from a smile at court. Who had suffered? Who had money for clove oil? Who had learned to live with the decay? Who had surrendered to hiding it? And who had perfected the art of pretending everything was fine? Visitors observed. They wrote about blackened teeth, about peculiar smiles, about a strange contrast between painted perfection and genuine discomfort. Yet they didn't discuss it publicly. That would be impolite. That would risk everything. So the smiles persisted, carefully controlled, painted on a mixture of grace and rot. It's worth noting that Queen Elizabeth herself had notoriously poor teeth in her final years. Her fondness for sweets was widely known, her breath less so, much discussed by foreign guests. She wore layers of makeup to distract from her mouth. She spoke quietly, and when she smiled, she did so with care. The court followed her lead. Teeth were not to be mentioned, only whitened or concealed or ignored, even if they ached, even if they bled. Today, dental care is standard. We brush, we rinse, We visit dentists with gentle lights and comfortable chairs. Yet back then, each bite of sugar was a gamble. Each smile was a show. Each toothache was a reminder that power couldn't shield you from pain. The royal mouth was a silent tragedy, covered in paint, hidden behind lace fans, whispered about, yet never confronted, and still the portrait smiled on. Now we'll move from the mouth to the crown, not the golden one, but the scalp beneath. Because what resided in royal hair wasn't always hair alone. The crown might have gleamed with rubies and pearls, yet underneath it, the scalp revealed a vastly different tale. Beneath the carefully arranged hair, under the veils and the complex headpieces, lay a place that most people in court preferred not to consider. A place that was hidden from sight, yet very much active. Because royal hair wasn't merely a symbol of beauty, it was a silent battlefield, and it had inhabitants. Lice were ubiquitous. They weren't a sign of poverty or poor upbringing, they were universal. Even queens scratched their scalps behind closed doors. Even distinguished duchesses asked their maids to search through the strands. There was no shame in it, only silence. It was part of existence, part of wearing heavy wigs, rarely washing and sleeping in the same position night after night. The hair was seldom cut. That was a mark of status. Long hair meant you weren't a labourer. It meant you had time, help, and mirrors. Yet long hair also meant knots. It meant days of accumulation. It meant the perfect hiding place for pests. So ladies combed and combed every morning, every evening, with fine-toothed combs made from ivory or horn. They worked through each section, sometimes for hours. These combs weren't just for styling. They were tools meant to catch eggs, remove lice, and scratch at the irritated scalp. It was a painful routine, yet a necessary one. Some ladies rubbed vinegar into the roots. Others crushed herbs and oils into a mixture. They believed rosemary might repel the lice, that lavender would calm the itch. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Wigs complicated everything. Wigs were stylish. They covered grey hairs. They created height. They were shaped into impossible forms that no real hair could achieve. Yet, wigs were also warm and dark and rarely cleaned. They were a haven for lice, a portable home. Once a wig was infested, it needed to be boiled or burned. Few were willing to do either. Most simply powdered it, perfumed it, and hoped for the best. Underneath the wigs, the real hair suffered. The scalp was irritated. The roots were fragile, the smell was stale, the maids applied more powder, more oil, anything to mask what lingered. Yet the weight of the wig pressed down, the itch returned, the cycle continued. Head coverings made things worse. They were made of velvet, silk and fur, they retained the heat, they trapped moisture, they were worn indoors and outdoors, they were rarely aired out. When removed at night, they left marks on the forehead and a line of dampness across the back of the neck. The following morning they went right back on. Royal ladies often slept with their hair braided tightly to prevent knots to maintain the curl. Yet the tightness pulled at the scalp, caused wounds, created perfect folds for lice to deposit eggs. When these ladies awoke, they reached for the comb again. Servants endured the burden of it. They washed the clothing. They searched through the hair. They swept up the powder and the fallen strands. Some wore gloves. Most didn't. It was an intimate job, and a never-ending one. You could never truly get ahead of the lice, only pursue them every day. Portraits deceived, as they always did. The hair in paintings was perfect. Each strand smooth, each curl obedient. No sign of flaking, no sign of redness, no sign of the tiny creatures that made life miserable. That wasn't the image anyone wanted to preserve, so it was painted away. Yet the ladies knew they could feel it, especially during formal occasions when movement was limited, when you couldn't scratch, when your crown had to remain perfectly centred. Every itch became a torture, every tickle raised a question. Was it lace rubbing your temple, or something else? There were attempts at remedies. Some courts imported powders from the East, claiming they killed lice instantly. Some maids boiled combs in wine. Some noblewomen shaved their heads completely and wore wigs full time. Yet even then, the scalp itched. It always did. It became part of the rhythm of royal life. Comb in the morning, powder at midday, perfume in the evening, scratch when no one was watching. Complain only to your most trusted maid, and wear your crown as if everything beneath it was as serene as your painted smile. The irony was striking. The most powerful ladies in the realm couldn't escape something as tiny as a louse. They could command armies, sign treaties, order executions, yet they couldn't stop the itch that arrived just before dinner or the crawling sensation during prayers. And still the court continued. Hair was braided, wigs were fluffed, crowns were polished. The pests endured, so did the ladies, not because they enjoyed it, but because that was the price of appearing perfect. Now we will look beyond the scalp and down the spine to the corsets, the stays, the layers of fabric that shaped royal bodies into ideals, even if they made breathing an occasional luxury. Underneath the powdered hair and behind the jewelled veil, the royal body wasn't just a canvas for luxury, but also a prisoner of fashion. Corsets weren't soft accessories. They were rigid, tightly laced cages made of whalebone, canvas, and often lined with horsehair. These weren't meant to comfort. They were built to reshape, to compress the waist, lift the chest, and force the back into an unnatural line of upright elegance. And royal ladies wore them for hours, sometimes for entire days, sometimes even while sleeping. The discomfort wasn't the worst part. It was what happened beneath the fabric that made things particularly unpleasant. The corset embraced the body so tightly that it prevented proper airflow. Sweat collected in hidden creases, skin rubbed raw, bruises formed where metal or bone pressed too long. The area under the breasts would often chafe. Rashes appeared. It wasn't unusual for a red line to remain long after the corset came off. Yet the corset didn't come off very often. That was part of the problem. Cleaning these corsets was another issue altogether. They weren't washed regularly. You couldn't soak something stuffed with whalebone or lined with stiffened fabric. Water would destroy it. So instead, maids would dab them with vinegar, perhaps hang them outside to air. If someone had extra money, they might sprinkle in dried herbs or scented powder to mask the smell. Yet make no mistake, the smell was there. Odour settled in the seams. It lingered like an old memory. Add to that the layers worn over the corset, undergarments, bodices, dresses made of heavy brocade or velvet. Each layer trapped more heat, more moisture, more odour. And because washing those outer garments was expensive and risky, they weren't cleaned either. So the layers of clothing didn't just rest on the skin. They functioned like a slow cooker, keeping everything warm, damp and unpleasant. Sometimes fainting wasn't about drama, it was about being unable to breathe. A tightly laced corset could make walking across a room an effort. Dancing during court festivities was an ordeal. Sitting still in church could feel like an act of endurance. And yet, all the while, you were expected to smile, to radiate poise and grace, even if your ribs ached and your underarms itched. Servants would often whisper that they could tell a lady's rank by her scent. Not her perfume, but what lay underneath. A duchess might smell of sandalwood and trapped sweat. A princess might carry hints of rose oil mixed with musty linen. No one said this aloud, yet everyone knew you could recognise a person by the corset-shaped aroma they left behind. For young girls entering court, the corset was introduced early. It was a rite of passage, a symbol that childhood was ending and womanhood was beginning. Yet no one explained the blisters. No one warned them about the headaches from shallow breaths. They learned quickly and quietly, adjusting their postures, their movements, their expectations. At times, a lady might loosen her laces in private just a bit, enough to take a deep breath or eat a little more at supper. Yet that was a luxury reserved for behind-the-curtain moments. At public banquets or royal audiences, the corset had to stay tight. Appearances first, lungs second. Doctors occasionally voiced concern. They wrote about displaced organs and restricted digestion. Some even blamed the corset for miscarriages. Yet fashion rarely listens to medicine, especially not at court. If the queen laced tight, so did everyone else. No one wanted to be the lady who looked relaxed next to royalty. Relaxed, after all, often meant wide-waisted, and that wasn't the goal. Wearing the same corset every day also meant sharing your secrets with it. It knew what you ate, knew. It held onto the sense of last night's stew or today's spiced wine. It remembered your sweat, your fear, your stress, and unlike a friend, it never forgot. It held tight, pressed close. Whispers clung to it, the kind you couldn't perfume away. Corset stays would sometimes break. The sound was sudden, like a bone snapping, and it came with a mix of panic and relief. Panic because someone might notice. Relief because for one blessed moment your body had a bit more room. Some ladies carried spares, others sent maids running. Yet everyone understood. A broken corset wasn't a scandal. It was an inevitable part of royal life. When a lady finally removed her corset at the end of the day, her skin bore its memory. Red grooves, damp patches. A sharp contrast between the air outside and the heat trapped underneath. The relief was immediate, yet the freedom was short-lived. Tomorrow it would go back on. The laces would pull tight. The routine would begin again. And through it all, no one complained. Not really. Complaining made you seem fragile. Fragility made you seem weak. And weakness had no place in royal portraiture. So they endured with powdered faces, straight backs and hidden scars. Yet underneath the corset, underneath the illusion, their bodies were exhausted, sore, strained. Sometimes they weren't even sure where their shape ended and the corset began. Now we'll move even further down, past the bones and bruises to the feet, where shoes that looked elegant from a distance told a much less glamorous story up close. After corsets came shoes, and while they were seldom the first thing anyone noticed in a royal palace portrait, they carried more than their share of quiet suffering. Shoes in royal courts weren't made for walking. They were designed for display. They completed the illusion of elegance, the performance of dignity. Yet when you stepped closer and looked below the silks and brocade hems, what you found wasn't always so refined. Royal footwear in the past centuries was often made from leather, silk or velvet stretched over a stiff base. Soles were thin, sometimes just layers of fabric or soft leather stitched together. Heels, if present, were modest and offered little support. There were no cushioned insoles, no arch support, just flat resistance pressing up against the foot with every step. And yet these shoes were worn for hours, sometimes for ceremonies that lasted half the day, sometimes while standing still in galleries with cold marble floors. Yet discomfort wasn't the worst part. What truly turned these royal shoes into hygiene nightmares was how little they were cleaned. Feet enclosed in tight fabric and pressed against non-breathable linings would sweat. And that sweat had nowhere to go. The shoes absorbed it slowly, day after day, without ever being truly aired out. They were rarely washed. If the outside got dirty, it might be brushed. If it smelled, perhaps a sprig of mint or a puff of powder was tucked inside, yet the inside, that was left to ferment. And so, over time, the shoes took on a life of their own. They began to develop a scent that was neither floral nor faint, a mixture of damp leather, old powder, and something unmistakably human. Each step carried the history of days before the heat, the stress, the long walks down dark hallways or across sticky palace kitchens. You didn't just wear the shoes, you marinated in them. To make things worse, many royal ladies were expected to wear stockings underneath. These weren't modern cotton blends. They were usually wool or silk, tightly woven, and rarely laundered. If a lady had 3 or 4 pairs, she was fortunate. Often she would rotate them, brushing them off after each use. Washing them meant risking damage, so instead they were hung near the fire or aired near a window, freshened with herbs, yet not scrubbed with soap. And it showed. In private, maids sometimes gagged while removing shoes. They learned to hold their breath, to turn their heads, yet they never said anything. It wasn't their place. The mistress might sigh with relief as her feet were freed, yet the shoes were placed carefully aside to be worn again the next day. Over time, feet suffered, blisters formed and never quite healed, toenails thickened and yellowed. Some ladies developed infections between their toes, hidden beneath layers of hosiery and etiquette. They walked carefully, slowly, not from grace, but because of pain. Yet no one mentioned this. It was considered improper to speak of feet at all, let alone foot odour. That was something reserved for jokes about peasants, not queens. And yet queens suffered too. Some records mention foot baths, small wooden tubs filled with rosewater or vinegar. Yet these were rare luxuries, not daily habits. The water might be reused by multiple people. Sometimes it sat for hours before use. A warm basin placed before sore feet might offer temporary comfort, yet it didn't cleanse. It soothed the symptoms without touching the cause. When shoes were finally replaced, they weren't thrown away. They were passed down, given to servants, or stored in boxes where the scent would surprise the next hand to open them. The smell of age, of rank, of skin. In colder months, the problem worsened. Fireplaces dried out the air, yet feet still sweated under layers of wool. In damp castles with stone floors, shoes would grow mildew, a soft white patch along the sole. It was brushed off, ignored, forgotten, until it returned again. Even paintings couldn't hide it. Look closely at a court scene and you'll see ladies seated with one foot half turned, always angled away from the viewer. It looks graceful, yet it might just be modesty for something less poetic. Because while faces were powdered and hands were gloved, feet remained stubbornly real. And real meant flawed. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. Some noble women had dozens of shoes, slippers for indoor use, riding boots, embroidered pieces just for banquets. Yet even then, variety didn't mean cleanliness. More often than not, it just meant spreading the problem across more pairs. There were jokes about the smell, quiet ones. A courtier might chuckle to himself after stepping behind a lady who left a particular impression. A musician might swap instruments with a wrinkled nose after standing too close to a shoe bench. Yet no one laughed too loudly. It was a shared secret, something that didn't need to be said aloud. And so the shoes continued, passed on, worn down, softened by sweat and memory. Each pair a testimony not just to fashion but to endurance. And when a lady limped, no one asked. They admired her grace, her elegance, her restraint, even if every step was a reminder that beauty in the court of kings and queens had a price, and that price was often paid in silence and in very damp stockings. Next, we'll rise again, away from the feet and towards something far more delicate, a practice that mixed status with discomfort in a way few other things could. Powdered skin, not just for beauty, but for hiding much more than wrinkles. Powdering the face may sound harmless today. A light dusting to reduce shine, perhaps to even out the skin. Yet in royal courts of the past, the powder was more than just a cosmetic touch. It was a mask, a barrier, a symbol of power, status, and control. It was also, unfortunately, one of the most quietly harmful hygiene habits worn proudly by the elite. Let's start with the basics. The white powder most commonly used wasn't some innocent blend of chalk and cornstarch. It was often made from lead, ground into a fine dust mixed with vinegar or rose water and smeared generously onto the skin. The whiter the face, the higher the rank. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors. It meant you had people to fetch your food, light your fire, lace your gown. A healthy tan. That was for peasants. For royalty, the goal was ghostly. Applying this powder was a daily ritual. A thick base was spread across the forehead, cheeks and chin. Then came the layers. More powder. Then, sometimes a bit of colour was added back in with crushed petals or iron oxide to create a blush. The irony was never lost on anyone. Ladies first wiped out all natural signs of life from their faces, then painted artificial life back on in carefully measured dots and swirls. Yet underneath all that, the skin couldn't breathe. Pores were clogged, sweat and oil had nowhere to go. Blemishes formed, irritations worsened, and then came the problem no one wanted to discuss: the smell. The combination of sweat trapped under lead mixed with aging perfume and skin oils gave the powder a scent that didn't fade. Some described it as sour. Others said it reminded them of wet fabric left in the sun. Yet everyone agreed it lingered. Powdered faces didn't stay pristine. They cracked during long dinners, melted slightly during warm ceremonies. Fine lines became more noticeable as the powder settled into creases. And yet ladies reapplied, not just once, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day. With each new layer, the weight increased. The air beneath the powder thickened. Skin beneath began to itch. Scratching wasn't an option, not in public. So ladies used fans, not to cool themselves, but to discreetly tap at their cheeks. A tiny flick here, a soft flutter there. Anything to relieve the crawling sensation under all that product. At night, some attempted to remove the powder. They used vinegar, soaked cloths, or milk, or even urine in rare cases. Yet it never came off entirely. Some traces always remained, especially along the hairline and around the nose. And so the cycle began again the next day, layer upon layer, irritation upon irritation. Elizabeth I was a notorious user of white lead makeup. Her face became a canvas of power, yet also of secrecy. Underneath that pale mask were scars from smallpox. Her courtiers copied her look, not because they admired her condition, yet because they feared falling behind in the fashion game. Looking healthy was less important than looking royal, and looking royal meant looking white. What people didn't realise, or chose to ignore, was that lead was slowly poisoning them. It caused hair loss, headaches, tremors, mood swings. Some even believe it shortened lives, yet none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the impression, the illusion. A lady might feel faint, her skin might flake beneath the powder, yet as long as the room saw beauty, she had done her duty. The worst was in the summer. Heat mixed with heavy layers of clothing, stale air and dense cosmetics. Powder mixed with sweat and dripped down collars. Maids tried to pat their mistresses dry without smudging their faces. Some nobles even kept extra collars to change midday, not for fashion, yet to hide what the face left behind. The powder got everywhere. It clung to lace, it stained fans, it settled into the bristles of brushes that were never properly cleaned. Rooms used for dressing eventually smelled like powder and perfume, yet with a hint of something sour beneath the scent of skin under stress, of beauty under siege. And still no one stopped. The powder was as essential as jewels, more so even. You might leave your necklace behind, yet never your powder box. It was carried in pouches, displayed on dressing tables, and given as gifts. To be without it was to appear unfinished, and being unfinished at court could mean being forgotten. There was also an art to powdering. Too thick and you looked corpse-like, too thin and your natural colour peeked through. Ladies practised in mirrors, adjusting the light, checking each side of the face. Some hired specialists just for the application. Not physicians, not caretakers, yet artists of illusion. Yet the powder didn't just sit on the skin, it invaded. It got into noses, into mouths, left a chalky taste on the tongue if you licked your lips at the wrong time. And when you sneezed, which happened often thanks to the fine dust, you were expected to turn away gracefully, then reapply discreetly. A powdered lady didn't lose her composure, even when her nostrils burned. What made it worse was that once you started using powder, it was hard to stop. The skin underneath grew dependent. pale from lack of sunlight, weakened by blocked pores, red from irritation. Ladies who tried to go without were often asked if they were ill, because in a world ruled by powdered norms, a natural face looked strange, suspicious. Even so, day after day the powder came back, patted on, gently pressed into the skin, locked in place with layers of perfume and silent expectation. And while it created a beautiful surface, it also created a hiding place, a place where hygiene surrendered to appearance, where the skin cried for air yet was told to wait. Now we'll pull the curtain back on something even more hidden, a part of royal life rarely spoken about, yet just as telling. The bed and everything that lived inside it, beneath all the silk and splendour, behind the carved bedposts and gold-stitched drapes, there was a truth few talked about. A truth that rustled softly under layers of linen. The royal bed, a place where queens were meant to rest, to dream, to hold court in private, yet also a place where hygiene quietly failed. Because beneath the glamour of royal bedding was something far less majestic. Something that crawled, itched and scratched when the lights went out. Royal beds were massive. 4 posters, thick canopies, mountains of pillows, and layer upon layer of blankets. Feather mattresses stacked on top of straw or horsehair foundations. They looked magnificent, regal, fit for ceremony and portrait painting. Yet they weren't just uncomfortable, they were ecosystems, entire little worlds teeming with life you couldn't always see, yet felt. The bedding itself was heavy. Linen sheets, woolen blankets, brocade bedspreads. These fabrics absorbed everything. Sweat, oils, perfume, powder, and they weren't washed as often as one might hope. Washing large pieces of fabric was labour-intensive. Water had to be hauled, soap was expensive, and drying took days, especially in damp stone castles. So instead of regular washing, sheets were brushed, shaken out, aired near windows or fireplaces, perhaps sprinkled with dried lavender or rose petals to improve the smell. Yet that was surface treatment. The deeper problem remained untouched. And then came the lice. Not just the kind that lived on the head, yet the kind that settled into seams. Body lice, bedbugs, fleas. They burrowed into the feather-stuffed mattresses and hid in the corners of the wooden frames. They came out at night. You might feel them first as a tickle on the ankle, then a bite on the wrist. Red marks that didn't disappear. By morning, ladies scratched under their nightgowns and then covered the spots with powder. By day, no one said anything because everyone, even royalty, was dealing with the same discomfort. The court would occasionally call for fumigators. They'd burn aromatic plants beneath the bed frames or sweep incense throughout the royal quarters. This would cover the odour temporarily. A few pests might scatter, but the core issue remained unsolved. The vermin always returned, because regardless of how pristine the appearance or sweet the cologne, those beds still harboured skin cells, perspiration, and grime. And queens weren't the sole occupants of these sleeping quarters. They slept alongside ladies in waiting, visiting dignitaries, sometimes children too. Beds weren't personal spaces as we understand them now. They served as places for politics, for waiting, for hushed discussions and shared discomfort. One woman might shift during sleep, discovering her bedmate had been clawing at bites for hours. The linens moved, the covers grew moist, yet nobody voiced complaints. Grumbling showed frailty. Some attempted protection. They donned linen sleeping caps, long-sleeved nightgowns, wool stockings. They secured their cuffs tightly and drew blankets to their necks. Still, nothing kept all intruders away. Come morning, they'd awaken with welts on their forearms, hair dishevelled from restless tossing, and eyes slightly bloodshot from nights that demanded endurance over slumber. Bed mattresses were seldom changed. The cost was prohibitive. A down mattress might serve for years, but throughout that time it soaked up more than comfort. Spills, skin oils, occasionally blood. Servants would flip them, pound them with rods, drape them over balconies in sunlight. Yet sunshine alone couldn't reverse what had accumulated through months of human occupation. The odour persisted, a blend of mustiness and something faintly acidic, a smell that caught in your throat when you laid down and inhaled too deeply. During royal travels, the bedding came along. It was bundled in wagons, dragged across muddy paths, reassembled in fresh chambers with identical sheets, identical mattresses. The same pests, concealed and patient, awaited darkness. Sometimes servants nicknamed them sleeping partners, a quiet jest among staff who'd long stopped being shocked by what they discovered between the linens. Even bed-making became ritualistic. Maids donned gloves. They raised each layer with care, smoothed every wrinkle, tucked small bunches of dried plants beneath pillows, not for freshness, but to repel insects. Yet it was a futile fight. The plants wilted, the bugs came back, and the queen settled down again, expressions serene, hands clasped, minds on affairs of state. Even while something tiny crept near their feet, there were brief respites. Fresh bedding arrived after festivals. A new mattress was presented during nuptials. The scent of sun-dried cotton, following an exceptionally warm spell. But these instances were uncommon, brief, quickly consumed by the gradual return of heat, dampness, and human traces. Some royal ladies endured quietly. Others grew fixated on bedding ceremonies, switching sheets more frequently, requesting herbal treatments, paying premiums for foreign linens. Yet no matter their efforts, the trouble persisted. Because the problem wasn't merely the bed, it was how people existed in close quarters. Inadequate airflow, thick garments, infrequent washing, and all of this accompanied them beneath the covers. When we look back, we see these women in paintings, calm, dignified, clothed in material so delicate they appear ethereal. But nobody depicts the scratching, nobody sketches the wakeful nights spent batting at unseen bites, or the quiet movement of a servant washing hands after folding a moisture-stained sheet. Royalty may have lived magnificently, but they also coexisted with things we've long expelled from our bedrooms. Now we shift to something even more delicate, something not worn or rested upon, but breathed in. Aromas designed to command attention. Fragrances created to symbolize authority. Yet behind every royal scent lay a blend that would give your nostrils pause. Perfume, at surface level, appears the most refined of indulgences. A gentle spray, a flowery wake left in one's path. In royal circles, fragrance was more than vanity. It was identity. It entered the room ahead of a queen. It remained after her departure. But not every perfume was delicate, and not every aroma was agreeable. Behind the elegant bottles and golden labels, perfume often served as a frantic answer to something unavoidable. The endless struggle against body scent. In an era where regular bathing was uncommon and laundering clothes was laborious, perfume became protection. Royal women depended on it not merely for court gatherings, but for daily existence. Their bodies encased in heavy materials, cloth captured moisture. Their skin, powdered and painted, absorbed smoke and perspiration, and with each passing hour, the scent layers accumulated, so they applied more. Not water, not cleansers, but essences, extracts. Aromatic ointments massaged into wrists, throat, and temples, sometimes even onto the bottoms of their feet. The components differed based on wealth and geography. Musk was popular, often extracted from animal glands. Civet, taken from the scent pouches of a small African creature, added a rich, earthy quality. Ambergris, collected from sperm whale digestive tracts, provided depth and staying power. Then came the botanicals, rose, jasmine, lavender, all crushed, soaked in spirits or oil and carefully bottled. But the animal elements made the distinction. they helped the fragrance endure, and they helped it adhere to skin that hadn't touched water in weeks. Perfume application was part of morning ritual, a few drops behind the lobes, a saturated ribbon fastened around the middle, gloves soaked in scented oils and worn for hours, so the aroma would gradually escape with each gesture. Some women even positioned perfumed wax pellets in their hair where scalp warmth would melt them throughout the day. It wasn't merely personal, it was social. Perfume displayed rank. If you could purchase it, you showcased it. If you couldn't, you attempted to stay near someone who could. The challenge naturally was proportion. One perfume layer might smell delightful, two could remain pleasant. But once a woman added her third or fourth, the impact started changing. The fragrance intensified. It combined not only with her skin, but with the odours of old powder, used fabrics and candle smoke. The outcome wasn't always appealing. Some called it overpowering. Others claimed it caused dizziness. But nobody spoke openly. Because at court, smelling intense was preferable to smelling natural. The perfume didn't remain limited to the body. It penetrated dresses, chairs, bedsheets. Drapes absorbed it. Gloves transferred it between palms. And eventually, it became a trademark. People identified others not just by appearance or speech, but by scent. A queen's approach was often detected before being observed. A haze of amber and rose, perhaps with a hint of something musky, drifted down the corridor. But perfume served another function. It was thought to shield. People believed sweet smells could ward off sickness. Miasma theory, widespread during the Renaissance, suggested that bad air spread disease. So to remain healthy, one needed to inhale pleasant air. Royal women embraced this concept. They carried pomanders, small vessels filled with herbs and aromatic resins. These dangled from belts, from neck chains, or were gripped in gloved fingers during audiences. When entering packed rooms or passing through towns, they held them near their noses. It was both ceremony and protection. Yet not every scent was welcome. The mixing of numerous perfumes in confined spaces created a conflicting symphony of smells. A chamber full of courtiers could smell like a spice bazaar gone wrong. Rose fought with civet. Jasmine wrestled with musk. And underneath it all, the constant suggestion of unwashed flesh. It was choreographed deception, everyone attempting to out-scent everyone else, nobody willing to acknowledge the reality. Servants suffered most. They prepared the oils, aired out gowns reeking of last week's perfume, tried not to choke while brushing fragrant dust from embroidered sleeves. Some developed migraines. Others grew accustomed to the perpetual haze. But none could afford to complain. Their role was to maintain the fantasy, to pretend the queen's scent originated from blossoms alone and not from hours of desperate concealment. There were, naturally, mishaps, bottles shattered, scents spoiled. Sometimes the mixture turned rotten in the warmth. A perfume that once smelled like roses began to smell like vinegar and musk. But rather than throw it away, women often layered on more. A touch of orange flower here, a splash of sandalwood there. It was like painting over a stained canvas repeatedly, hoping the fresh colour would mask what lay underneath. Some queens became famous for their signature combinations. Elizabeth May reportedly preferred damask rose and cinnamon. Others gravitated toward lavender and sage, but even these choices evolved over time. As their bodies matured and their skin altered, so did how the perfume settled. A fragrance that smelled lovely on one woman might turn harsh and bitter on another. Still, the practice continued, because to appear without scent was to appear unfinished. And yet, when the perfume weakened at day's end, the truth always emerged. Gowns heavy with residue, skin layered in oil and powder, bed linens that smelled less like roses and more like struggle. The queen's scent may have been crafted, but it was also built over something very human, something that perfume could only postpone, not eliminate. Now, we'll venture even further into royal routine. Beyond the powder, past the perfume, into the one ritual that was supposed to cleanse, but often made things worse. The rare bath and everything that accompanied it. Bathing was meant to be the moment of salvation, the great refresh, an opportunity to wash away the days, the sweat, the smell of everything else. But in royal history, a bath was seldom that straightforward. It wasn't a daily occurrence. It wasn't even a weekly one. For many queens, it was an undertaking, something scheduled, arranged, and executed. And despite all the ceremony, it often left them feeling less clean than they'd hoped. To start, water had to be carried in manually. Buckets filled from streams, wells, or reservoirs warmed slowly over open fires, then emptied into large wooden vessels, sometimes draped with cloth or cushioned with towels. The procedure took hours. Dozens of servants moved constantly. The bath needed to be perfectly temperate, not boiling, not freezing. Plants or flower petals were added to disguise the natural smell of the water, which wasn't always pure. Sometimes it had been kept in containers for days. Once ready, the queen was assisted into the vessel. She didn't bathe alone. Servants stood nearby to wash, rinse, and bring more water. Privacy was a privilege not always granted, even in these moments. And yet, for all the preparation, the cleaning was mostly superficial. There was no scrubbing in the modern sense, just gentle wiping, gentle patting, a little rose oil on the shoulders, a cloth to the feet. But the body in its entirety remained largely untouched. The soap, when employed, was different too, not the foamy, sweet-smelling bars we recognise today. It was rough, often made with animal fat and ashes. It burned if it reached the eyes. It parched the skin. Some women avoided it entirely, preferring to depend on scented oils to create the impression of freshness. They would exit the bath gleaming, not because they were clean, but because they were coated in something meant to smell better than sweat. And there were dangers. Bathing was thought to open the pores. Open pores were believed to invite disease. Some physicians discouraged it completely. Better to stay dry and healthy than clean and exposed. So many queens bathed only when required, before major events, weddings, childbirth, a coronation, or when sickness made it necessary. Between times they used other methods. Linen rags rubbed under the arms, sprigs of rosemary placed into bodices, powder scattered generously across the back. Even the vessels themselves were questionable. Wood soaked up moisture and developed odours. Metal cooled too rapidly. Some vessels were lined with leather or fabric to make them more pleasant. But these coverings were rarely cleaned between sessions. And so the very place intended to purify the body became a breeding ground for germs. A bath could leave a woman feeling soothed, yes, but also with an itchy rash or simply let down. And when it concluded, the drying process began slowly, layer by layer. Towels were rough, not gentle. Hair was rarely washed with water, so it stayed wrapped in fabric or left alone. The skin was dabbed down, then coated again in oils. By the finish, the queen appeared polished, majestic, prepared for another day at court. But underneath the surface, she carried the same irritation as before, only now disguised in lavender and sweat. All of this was deemed normal, anticipated. Nobody expected royalty to smell like soap and fresh air. They smelled like humans. Humans under stress, humans in brocade, humans who had to keep up appearances at any cost. And that upkeep didn't include plumbing or cleanliness standards. It included a facade, layers of scent, ceremonies of dusting, the occasional bath when it could no longer be avoided. So while the palace appeared immaculate from outside, it pulsed with a different rhythm within. A rhythm of bodies, of warmth, of linen worn thin by constant dabbing, the smell of cinnamon competing with civet, of rose. Water poured over skin that had experienced little else, and always, beneath it all, the quiet reality that royal life, for all its spectacle, was not particularly aromatic. When we picture queens, we envision grace, elegance, hair brushed countless times, robes flowing behind like mist. But the actual queens of history moved through chambers thick with perfume, powder, and perspiration. They ran households, delivered heirs, signed documents, and smiled through layers of irritation. And at night, they rested in beds that itched and rustled, beds that held the day's secrets in their stitches. Their lives were splendid, yes, but also rough. Not because they lacked refinement, but because they lacked modern conveniences. Because their bodies, though dressed in golden thread, still perspired, still itched, still yearned for cool air and a fresh sheet. And in this, they were perhaps not so different from anyone else, just a bit more lustrous on the surface. So tonight, as you slip into your bed, take a moment, a brief one, and feel thankful. For clean sleepwear, for cotton that breathes, for a mattress that doesn't creak or crawl, for the chance to step into a shower and emerge renewed. These are simple things, easy to overlook, but they are privileges of a sort. Elizabeth I could only dream of. The past is captivating, beautiful in its way, but also wrapped in discomfort. A place of authority, yes, but also of powder, of scent designed to mask what couldn't be washed. And while history loves to adorn its queens, to show us their crowns and their velvet, it rarely shows us the wash basin, the cloth, the scratching behind the tapestry. And perhaps that's the most human part of all, the reminder that beneath every crown was a head that sometimes just needed to be cleaned. Thank you for joining us. Through the aromas, the silks, and the peculiar customs of history's royal women, may your night be fresh, your sheets smooth, and your dreams blissfully free of tallow candles and civet oil. Sleep well,